Chapter 529. As the busiest commercial port and cargo distribution center in Erewhon, and even the entire southern part of Cruz, the port was bustling all day long, from the early hours of the morning when the lampposts were hung with cold, shaky lights until the moon rose above the sea. Merchants and dockworkers were busy all day long, accumulating an astonishing amount of wealth for this giant port. Only during the season when storms visited the shining sea every year would this golden sea route be deserted, allowing the residents of the city to stop and rest for a while. Archbishop Wood stood under the white stone lighthouse, wearing a white robe with red trim. A figure like him was sent here by the Holy Cathedral to serve as the bishop of the Amberlight diocese and the spiritual leader of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in Erewhon. As long as he stayed in this position for 15 years, he would have the qualifications to enter the core power of the Holy Cathedral and become one of the 11 great priests. At that point, even the position of High Priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was just a step away. Most people would not be able to imagine what a person of his status would want. Wood's face was thin and his cheeks were sunken. Even though he was not even 80 years old, he looked like an old man who had been through a lot. Only his sunken eyes were still bright and full of vigor. His majestic aura was enough to make a normal person cower in fear. The archbishop pursed his lips and looked calm, but his heart was not any calmer than the nobles in Erewhon who had been around for a while. The lion beast men in Toquinen are ready to make a move. They must have the support of the Holy Cathedral of Earth. Wood stood on the hillside and looked at the sailing ships of various sizes coming in and out of the port, leaving long trails in the blue bay. The sailing sails formed a strange sight in the waters of the pier. Every waterway was full of experienced navigators waiting to enter and exit. The wealth contained in the endless stream made the high and mighty man sigh. Erewhon is the front line against the Holy Cathedral of Earth. We cannot allow this civil war to continue for too long. We don't have much time left. Beside him, his good friend, Priest Icon, nodded in agreement. The two of them had been partners for many years. Although neither of them were natives of Erewhon, they knew this ancient kingdom like the back of their hand. However, the lion beast men are getting restless. If they really want to invade, they'll probably have to wait until next year. Especially since they haven't received any rations this autumn, the Earth Holy Hall won't dare to act rashly. Wood glanced at his companion. Do you know how old this white stone lighthouse is, Icon? Priest Icon glanced at the lighthouse beside them. This lighthouse was once the symbol of Amberlight. When the late King Eric built the port here, Amberlight was far from its current size, and it was not a so-called trading port. This lighthouse once guided the navy of the late King Eric and the navy of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to battle on the nearby sea. The white stone lighthouse had always been seen as a symbol of Erewhon, a symbol of persistence in the darkness. It's a pity that the lighthouse was destroyed in a fire 50 years ago. Its historical value was also destroyed. Although a new lighthouse was rebuilt, it's not the same as the original. Icon understood what his companion meant. He admired the royal faction and Her Royal Highness because they had the same persistence for glory as him. However, history was history, and Wood was obviously reminding him to look at all of this fairly. This kingdom is the same. No matter how old it is, the glory it insisted on has been abandoned by its descendants. What's left is just a shell. In comparison, it was given a new mission just like this lighthouse. That's its true value. I understand, Lord Archbishop, Icon replied humbly. Wood nodded. The Holy Cathedral had always been fair and would not easily interfere in the internal affairs of its subordinate countries. That was why they could maintain their authority. He and his assistant had been partners for many years, and he admired his insistence on justice and honor. But that was then and this was now. He would never allow his assistant to interfere in Erewhon's internal affairs and side with the princess. Thinking of this, the archbishop could not help but look back at the direction of the city. Amberlight was one of the largest cities in the south. The harbor was connected to the back and the roofs extended far into the horizon like an ant's nest. The tallest building in the city was undoubtedly the temple of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The temple was looming in the fog. He could not help but think of what the little girl Magadal had mentioned to him and shook his head. That was impossible. The Holy Cathedral would not side with either side no matter what, and the great priest would not be so hasty. At this time, the bell on the white lighthouse rang again. The sound of the bronze bell caused the nearby ground to tremble and the sand to shake. The sound could be heard for dozens of miles, and even half of the city could hear it clearly. The bell indicated that a ship had entered the harbor. Wood and Icon looked up and saw a sailboat with 3 large sails entering the harbor. It's a ship coming back from Lubeck. Icon recognized the flag on the ship immediately. At this time of the year, the storm is about to close off the southern sea route. This should be the last ship coming back from Lübeck this month. It's a little late. People who sail the sea all year round are desperate. Wood looked at the ship and could not help but sigh. People are blinded by money. Although wealth is important, it is not as precious as life. Icon shook his head. But this time the archbishop did not agree. He only sighed with a famous joke by Hesse I, who was ridiculed as the king of the road in Erewin's history. Without wealth, how can there be life? The two high priests sighed on the lighthouse hill, but the officials of the Port Authority of Amberlight were not so idle. To be exact, these small people who were usually busy were almost in a mess. Kinoan of Paris was the son of a noble family in Amberlight that was neither too big nor too small. Relying on his father's connections, he finally became the deputy director of the Port Authority. However, less than half a week after he took office, a piece of news almost made him throw away the pointed helmet on his head and run away in panic. What did you say? Pallion, you bastard, what did I tell you yesterday? If you drink too much or joke with me again, I will definitely drive you out. I don't care who you are. The unlucky young man roared angrily at the communication crystal in his hand. He almost threw the valuable thing away. Do you think I'm an idiot? No, I'm serious. On the other end of the communication crystal was Kinoan's good friend. In Owen's words, they were brothers who grew up together. Even though they were both descendants of nobles, he was not very reliable. He drank too much, played with women while on duty, got into fights, and did almost everything that could be done on the docks. But Kinoan kept him here because their relationship could be described with the word iron. But at this moment, the usually sloppy young man seemed to have suffered a great shock. He said in a mournful tone, "Brother, I swear in the name of Lady Martha that I didn't lie to you. I really saw a demon whale. Of course, if the woman who claimed to be a female pirate didn't lie to me, listen to me, that thing is exactly the same as the tattoo on her left, but... No, I have to say that the things at sea are much scarier now. F***ck but don't mention that woman to me." Kinoan did not even care about the last bit of modesty he had as a noble. Of course, this generation of nobles did not have much modesty to speak of, especially young people who grew up in the mixed environment of Amberlight. He pulled at his collar fiercely, but when he heard that the other party swore in the name of Martha, he felt a little uncertain. He also understood that if possible, this lawless guy would even dare to sleep with Lady Martha. Of course, this was just a saying. Kinoan was now beginning to feel a little helpless. A demon whale was about to attack the port? Oh my God, was he living in a mythical era? Kinoan sat at his expensive mahogany desk and thought for a long time. With great difficulty, he came up with the following 3 comprehensive plans. Abscond with the money, abscond with the money, and abscond with the money. But he immediately crumpled his hair into a ball. If he did that, his old man would be the first to kill him. Kinoan was born to be as lawless as his good brother, and he was not even afraid of the king of Owen. However, he immediately revealed his true colors in front of his old man. When he thought of his old man's angry face, his legs turned to jelly. He grabbed the communication crystal with great difficulty and swallowed his saliva. "Brother, good luck, I'll take my leave first. Wait for me, I'll be right there." Kinoan's words turned into, "Wait for me, I'll be there right away." The soldiers at the port were in a mess, but at this moment, a certain person on the sea looked at Amberlight from afar and felt very helpless. The port city of Amberlight and the surrounding areas and towns have a population of 310,000. A huge magic system maintains the operation of the city, such as sewage, lighting, water supply, and garbage disposal. The mysterious magic that is rarely seen in the countryside south of Erewin is everywhere here. Merchants spend a lot of money to hire wizards to serve them. Some of these wizards have worked here for decades and are deeply rooted in their positions. The wizards have formed their own guild called the Eye of Amberlight. This wizard organization not only maintains the daily operation of the city, but also intervenes in the security of the port. They prevent adventurers from fighting and set up a city lock to prevent foreign wizards from casting spells in the city. They also set up a super large anti-air magic circle in the inner city of Amberlight to prevent the port from being attacked from the sky. Brando stood at the side of the ship and introduced the port to the others. Suddenly he sighed. He turned his head with a helpless and almost desperate look in his eyes. Finally, he saw the legendary monster, the king of the sea beasts, the demon whale that was as huge as a mountain wave its fins at them like a naughty child, and then slowly dived into the deep sea. My old man said that the demon whale's intelligence is not inferior to that of an adult, and now it seems that it is true. Captain James also saw this scene and could not help but sigh. But Amandina looked at Brando suspiciously and could not help but ask, "My lord, what exactly did you give the Nagas? Why did they look at you as if they were looking at their king? They actually let the demon whale escort us into the port. How are we going to hide our identities now?" "But I heard that the Nagas' king is a woman." After a week of training, the little Roman could now freely appear on the deck. She rolled her eyes and directly feminized Brando. Brando wiped the sweat off his forehead. He did not expect the Nagas to be so hospitable, but to let the demon whale escort them into the port, Brando felt that other than the dumb fish Sani, most people would not be able to do something so creative. He coughed and said in disbelief, "Let's see how it goes. Anyway, the people in the port don't know that this big guy is following us. As long as we don't admit it, it'll be fine." With that, he looked at the young captain. James shrugged and replied, "My lord doesn't want to be famous, so I naturally will not overstep my boundaries. My lord, you can rest assured about the people on my ship." At this point, the young captain was actually a little helpless. "To be honest, my lord's reputation is much higher than mine. Even if I don't say anything, they will still keep their mouths shut." What he was talking about was naturally the 2 bottles of holy water that Brando gave him. It could be said that the entire ship's sailors now respected Brando, who had a sword saint as his teacher and was a kind and amiable noble like a god. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 530. When the demon whale disappeared from the surface of the sea, the guards of the port of Amberlight almost set off their cannons in celebration. When Faraway docked, Brando and the rest were not interrogated because Lord Kinoan was busy thinking about how to write about how he fought off the legendary sea monster. Furthermore, there was more than one ship entering and leaving the port. No one would have thought that a demon whale was here to escort Faraway, a 3-masted ship that had just entered the port. Sometimes the truth was closer to a lie, but if anyone dared to tell Kinoan this, the head of the port authority would definitely throw them into the sea to feed the sharks. He did not want his subordinates to treat him like a fool. Faraway docked at Pier 14. As soon as Brando got off the ship, he saw Sue coming to greet him. Sue had arrived in Amberlight under her father's request. This almond-skinned girl with braided hair was now in charge of managing Tanajal's trade with the outside world. She enjoyed a lot of independence. When she was in Bragg's, she did her job faithfully. Brando trusted her and entrusted her with important tasks. Now, Sue controlled almost all of Tanajal's funds, but when she came to greet them, she was still wearing the same checkered dress as before. When Sue saw Brando, she was a little surprised. Although she knew about the changes in the past year from the letters she exchanged with her father, and knew about Brando's identity and the funds in his hands, she could not help but take a second look at Brando. Brando smiled at her. He was in a good mood to see an old acquaintance of Fortress Reedon. The girl ignored him with a straight face. Of course, she did not forget about her relationship with him. She heard that there were a few more girls around the Lord. She was not at ease leaving Freya in the hands of such a playboy. She was only willing to serve Brando because of her father. "Sue." The Roman jumped down from the gangplank and grabbed the girl's hand. His eyes were shining. "Thank you so much for the past few months. Are you okay? I heard from Uncle Reto that you often work late. He's very worried about you." The little Roman was now in charge of Tanajal's business and economy. In a sense, Sue was her direct subordinate. Of course, someone didn't realize it, but Sue couldn't ignore it. The girl glanced at Brando and lowered her head slightly. "Miss Roman. Don't be like that. Do you see that the Roman doesn't want to say anything? I can help you pass on the message." Sue didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the merchant lady's antics. He finally managed to maintain his solemn expression and asked, "Is father all right?" "He's doing well." Brando finally found the opportunity to interject. "As you know from the letter, everything in the territory is on the right track, and the war has come to an end. Although I don't approve of it, your father has officially become a farmer. He's lost a lot of hair over the reclamation of the Maxon region. He's like a real old farmer, and he's thrown my military training program aside." "He used to farm," Sue replied. "Well, then he's going back to his old profession." Brando replied somewhat mischievously. Sue thought of her father's appearance and her lips curled up slightly. However, she was dissatisfied with Brando's tone. She glared at him and asked stiffly, "What does my lord want to do next?" "Of course, I want to take a break first," Brando replied. This was the truth. Although he had been through many storms, he felt as if the ground was shaking after a week on the ship. If he was like this, there was no need to talk about the others. The young men of the White Lion Legion were fine on the ship, but when they stepped on solid land, they ran to the side and vomited. The little Roman's body swayed from side to side, but he didn't seem to be aware of it. I've already arranged a place to stay. It's in the city's Bohemia Inn. However, my lord brought a lot of people, and it would be too conspicuous for everyone to stay in one inn. That's why I rented the apartment opposite. It's safer and less likely to attract attention. In addition, I've also bought a farmhouse that can be used as shelter if necessary. Sue glanced at him and replied. Brando was slightly surprised. He didn't expect this girl to be so capable. She had completed her missions in the past few months in a very orderly manner. Brando liked her for her honesty and reliability, but he didn't expect her to be so quick-witted. Knowing that they might encounter trouble on this trip, she had already arranged a place for them in advance. Then let's go. Brando suddenly felt that it was too easy to have such a capable subordinate. Are there any carriages? Sue nodded. Not only were there carriages, but Sue had also prepared 10 of them. However, these 10 carriages weren't parked together, but set off in several batches. Brando led his men ride the carriages into the city first. It wasn't his first time in Amberlight, but he knew that the young men of the White Lion Legion who came from the countryside of Tonajal couldn't wait to see the largest and most prosperous city in Erewhon. The carriages entered the inner city from the port gate. Because of the constant flow of goods, the roads in this area were wet and emitted a salty smell of the sea. Most of the buildings on both sides of the road were all kinds of trading houses. From fur to logs, from gems to metal minerals, as well as art, gold and silver utensils, goods from all over the world gathered here. In any place south of Amberlight, you wouldn't see so many people gathered in one place. These people came from the north, the south and even foreign lands. Amandina even saw some merchants, mercenaries, adventurers and travelers from the Nine Phoenix Empire. They were all dressed differently and everyone in the carriage was stunned for a moment. The carriages passed by some tall buildings. Most of the merchants had built majestic trading houses to show the strength of their business groups. The noble lady and the merchant lady had never seen such a majestic building before. They couldn't help but exclaim, "It's amazing. Bragg City Hall is just like this." Brando didn't comment on Amandina's words. The 14th Bishop of Amberlight, Andra, once said that, "There are gold and opportunities here." This sentence expressed the yearning of the people for this giant port, but countless people also went bankrupt here. People often only looked at the surface, but often ignored the opportunities and risks. The carriages passed by the second city gate. This was a majestic fortress. When Brando first came here in the game, he couldn't afford the expensive carriages in the city. He still remembered the shock of walking through the fortress. This was the gateway to Amberlight. Amberlight was not only a good trading port, but also a naval fortress of the late King Eric. Amberlight had mountains on both sides, and it was almost impossible to attack from land. The only way in was through the sea. Hence, the fortress that guarded this gateway was built to be extremely ridiculous. This petrol fortress looked like a towering mountain from the outside. Due to its special construction requirements, its watchtower could observe any ship within a radius of tens of nautical miles on the sea. Hence, the fortress looked particularly tall, especially when the Holy Cathedral added a giant statue of the Flame King on top of it during the second reconstruction. The entire fortress looked like a temple in the clouds. After passing through this fortress, there was Amberlight's famous Square Avenue. There were many hotels here, and the level of luxury was no less than that of the palace. There were also all kinds of luxurious apartments. Many foreign travelers and merchants lived here all year round. The locals called it the Golden Square. Although it was only a small area in the first half of the huge city, it was the most luxurious place in the port. Brando looked at the exquisite statues and gardening on the Square Avenue as he slowly walked away from the carriage. He couldn't help but have the illusion that he was revisiting an old place. But in fact, it was just that he was revisiting an old place, only slightly different. Brando still couldn't see the future. The first time he came here was during the flower festival in Amberlight. At that time it was much more lively, not to mention the players. "It's so beautiful." The Roman leaned her whole body against the window of the carriage, her chin resting on the window frame as she muttered to herself. It was worrying that she would collapse one side of the carriage. "The future Valhalla will be even more beautiful," Brando replied. "Really?" The Roman turned her head. She really did turn her head. This young lady seemed to be too lazy to even move her body. She used her chin as a fulcrum to tilt her head, completing this difficult movement. Because she couldn't turn her head completely, she squinted at Brando, looking very cute. "Of course." Brando replied affirmatively. He had seen the world tree in the loop of trade winds, and he had no doubts about the future of his territory. Besides, it was his city. How could it be bad? But in the midst of the conversation, the carriage suddenly stopped, and some guards appeared outside the carriage. Brando was slightly startled. He thought that the guards of the Port Authority had finally reacted and came to arrest the culprit. But he saw Sue, who was sitting opposite him, shaking her head at him, indicating that they didn't need to be nervous. What's going on? Nothing. I heard that the Lion Men in the north are about to make a move, and the Holy Cathedral has tightened the security. Ampere Seal is a mixed bag, and this is to prevent spies from sneaking into Erewhon disguised as merchants, Sue said lightly. Brando remembered that there was indeed such a thing. Historically, the Lion Men in Toquenin had been restless since the War of the Black Rose, but the tribes on the Great Plains also had a lot of problems to deal with, so they only invaded Erewhon in the spring of the second year after the Year of the Sword. When the war began, Erewhon had not recovered from the Civil War, but soon the Princess Regent, who had just come to power, stabilized the situation. Then the players joined the war, and that war was also the war that established the princess's prestige. But it was still early and there was still a year to go. Brando was relieved after hearing that, but he remembered something else and couldn't help but ask, how are the negotiations with the nobles? Ordinary people aren't too sure, but it's said that the first negotiation failed, and the next one will be a week later. Sue glanced at Brando. The negotiations between the princess and Duke Erek have made progress. Her ministers have met with the Duke's envoys 3 times this week, but I haven't heard that they have formed an alliance. Now that the nobles of the north and south have gathered in Ampere Seal, I guess the next meeting will be after the nobles' meeting. Brando nodded. This was more or less what he expected. Everything now was basically in line with the timeline in history and he still had some time. But when he looked at Sue, he couldn't help but sigh. That little barmaid from Fortress Reden had grown up so quickly, becoming a talent who could hold her own. No matter who saw Sue now, they wouldn't associate her with that little girl from before. Thinking of this, he was silent for a while and suddenly said, "Then if I want to participate in the nobles' meeting, is there any way?" "It's not easy." The girl shook her head gently. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 531. It was indeed not easy. Brando knew that this meeting of nobles was not so much a negotiation as it was a last resort for both sides to fight for bargaining chips. The participants were all at the peak of Erewhon's power. There were 6 dukes, Erek, Cipher, Covardo, Viro, Karsuk and Grinoires, 2 marquises, the Lord of the Sword Citadel, Marquis Balta, and the king's cousin, Marquis Yoakum. There were also 5 earls with special privileges, 2 archbishops of the Holy Cathedral, and many leading figures of Ampere Seal's merchant groups. It would be very difficult to blend in with these people without extraordinary means. Fortunately, this was not a temporary matter. The nobles would only start a new round of negotiations next week, so Brando had time. He entrusted this matter to Sue because he had more important things to do. After he settled the youths of the White Lion Legion, he took Amandina and Scarlet with him, rented a carriage and went straight to the inner city. The destination of the carriage was the Anderla Cathedral in the inner city. The cathedral was built in the year 227 of the First Era, more than 100 years ago. It was built by the merchants of the city and completed by the master architect, Ragnan. It was the most famous artistic treasure of Ampere Seal. The main hall was oval-shaped, with countless pillars extending out from the side walls. The sharp arched door at the front symbolized the majesty and supremacy of the divine authority. The pilgrims walked slowly up the 120 steps, and in front of them was a huge fountain square. It was majestic and natural. Carriages were not allowed to pass through the square in front of the Holy Cathedral. When Amandina and Scarlet stepped out of the carriage and saw the majestic Holy Cathedral, they couldn't help but be speechless. Anyone who came from the south and was called a country bumpkin by the locals of Ampere Seal would be stunned when they saw the Holy Cathedral. This was the only place where Erewhon could become a Templar Knight. Erewhon's Holy Cathedral of Fire had 2 ranks of knight. The Paladin Knight was a title given to those who had crossed the elemental barrier, and the Templar Knight was a real profession. In the beginning, the Templar Knight was a soldier monk of the Holy Cathedral, but it was later open to the nobles. Players who wanted to advance to this profession had to meet 2 conditions. One was to have a clean background, and the second was to be full of reverence for the Flame King's spiritual symbol, the Golden Fire. The latter was simple as long as their religious knowledge, cruise, reached level 10. The former was more troublesome, and players needed to get a recommendation letter of recommendation from the nobles. The letter in Brando's hand was sent in the name of Erewhon's academic master, Tullman. After the calamity of wolves, it was easy for Brando to ask for a recommendation letter. Besides, he already had the intention of becoming a Templar Knight, so he naturally would not let go of this opportunity. This was the second letter of recommendation that Tolman wrote to him. The old man joked that Brendel was a cunning little fox and nothing good would come out of it. He was obviously reminding Brendel that he had not forgotten about the small matter that Brendel had tricked him. Brando could only laugh at this. At that time he had no choice, and in all seriousness he did not lie. However, Brando did not want to start the Slate War prematurely and disrupt history, so it was not convenient for him to talk about this matter in detail. Brando handed the recommendation letter to the guard of the Holy Cathedral. Those who were able to become a Knight of Honor at the main entrance of the Amberlight Cathedral were not simple people. Most of these people were born nobles and had a certain amount of background. Therefore, the guard immediately recognized that the silver letter in Brando's hand had an extraordinary origin. He did not dare to be negligent, and after asking about Brando's intentions, he immediately led Brando to the back of the cathedral, where the priests rested. If it was an ordinary person, the guard naturally would not have done so. However, Brando was accompanied by the red-haired girl with a ponytail, Scarlet, and the noble girl in a black dress. The former's aura of a high-ranked warrior could not be faked, while the latter's aura was that of a high-ranked advisor. Moreover, Brando's current appearance was not bad, and coupled with the aura of a gold-ranked ranker, it naturally gave people the illusion that he was a person of high status. This was the reason why Brando only brought Scarlet and Amandina. At first glance, the guard mistook Brando for a descendant of a noble, and was already somewhat convinced in his heart. Coupled with the dazzling personal symbol on the silver letter, he did not dare to doubt it. The Amberlight Cathedral was divided into two parts, the front and back. Most people who entered the cathedral to worship would at most stop at the front of the cathedral. However, Brando was actually very familiar with the latter part of the cathedral. For example, the place he was currently in was actually the training area of the Knights of the Cathedral. It was divided into the dormitory area, 3 halls for training, and a meditation room. He was currently in the meditation room used for class advancement. The steps for a Templar Knight's class advancement were actually very simple. They only needed an experienced priest to use holy water to salute them. However, the special thing was that a Templar Knight could receive several levels of blessings at the beginning of their class advancement. Generally speaking, the higher the rank of the priest, the higher the level of blessings received. The levels of blessings were actually free levels, and to the natives, it was equivalent to having different levels of power after class advancement. This was a great temptation for ordinary people, so many nobles spent a lot of money to bribe the cathedral, hoping that their children would be saluted by a priest of higher status. Of course, the ones who saluted were usually the lower-ranked priests. The 2 priests of the Ampere-Seal diocese were of high status, and although they knew that their subordinates were bribed, they would not participate in the corruption. The guard found an elderly priest for Brando. When Brando saw the red border on the priest's white robe, his eyelids could not help but twitch. This old man was also a high-ranking priest, and his status was second only to the regional priests like Amon and Wood. However, he was still a respectable existence. Tolman's reputation was really big, even the cathedral had to do him a favor. He saw the guard whisper a few words in the elder priest's ear, and he guessed that the guard was probably explaining his identity and origin. The elder priest's eyes showed a look of uncertainty. Brando was very clear about the steps involved, and hurriedly handed in his letter of introduction. After the elder priest checked the letter, there was only caution in his eyes. In fact, Tolman's reputation was too prominent, and very few people knew that he had once held Fleetwood's current position. Although Tolman, who lived in Braggs, rarely appeared in the noble circle of Erewhon after leaving the position of the head of the Royal Library and handing over the position of the chief court mage, his name was definitely well known in this circle. Although Tolman was born in Erewhon, he was actually a Buga, and everyone knew this. Back then, the 4 sages had all received the grace of the Buga people. The Buga wizards could now have a transcendent status, not only because they were the Silver Folk, but also because they never intervened in the disputes of the 4 holy cathedrals. The 4 holy cathedrals were in awe of this neutral organization. May I ask what relationship you have with Master Tolman? After all, the elder priest was more mature. Tolman had been living in seclusion for many years, and now someone suddenly came with his letter to change class to a Templar Knight. Of course, he had checked the letter and there was nothing wrong with it, but he still had to ask for the details. I have nothing to do with the master, but the master had a little relationship with my family in the early years. He tried his best to be vague with his words. After all, he knew that no one would go to Tolman to verify his words. Even if there was, Tolman would probably help him lie. The elder priest nodded. The relationship between the nobles was complicated, and many people did not want to be too clear about it. Brando was more or less done. As long as the letter was not fake, it was enough. After all, this young man only wanted to change class to a Templar Knight, and not join the Holy Cathedral. He put away the letter and replied, "Originally, it was Master Tolman's request that the Lord Officiant personally salute you, but you came at a bad time. The Lord Officiant just happened to be out. Why don't you come back after a while?" As soon as the elder priest spoke, Brando saw the Holy Cathedral guard beside him suddenly become strange. Marcia above, there were countless people in Amberlight who were willing to pay any price to have the Archbishop perform the ritual for their children, but everyone knew that it was impossible. It was not just a matter of obtaining power, but a special honor. The Archbishop had only performed the ritual for one person in the past 10 years, and that was at the request of King Oberg VII. It was to improve the relationship between the Holy Cathedral and Aween, and that person was now the commander of the White Lion Legion, a territory of his own. Thinking of this, the Holy Cathedral guard could not help but stare at Brando a little dumbfounded, as if he wanted to see what was different about this young man. However, Brando secretly felt that things were not going well. He only came here to change class to a Templar Knight and not to do anything else. In his opinion, the less trouble there was, the better. Anyway, he did not care about the few free levels. It would be best if he could just find a third-rate archbishop to bow to him. Brando was now a little regretful that he asked Tolman to write the letter of introduction. If he really did get Wood to bow to him, he would probably be on the front page of the Noble Circle in Amberlight by tomorrow morning, and soon people would find out who he was. Brando did not believe that there were any secrets in this world that could really be kept. His current advantage was that the enemy was in the open while he was in the dark. If the Holy Cathedral really did this, he would probably be able to escape back to Tonajil tomorrow. Not only him, but also the reputation of the entire Holy Cathedral of Fire and Tolman himself would be ruined. Brando did not dare to imagine how terrible it would be. Fortunately, thanks to the protection of Lady Martha, Wood was not there. This was the only thing that let Brando breathe a sigh of relief. He hurriedly shook his head and replied, "There's no need. I just yearn for the way of the golden flames. As for who bowed to me, it doesn't matter." Brando's words were full of righteousness, and the elderly priest's eyes lit up when he heard it. He could not help but nod and say, "Not bad, not bad. There are very few young people who think like you nowadays. Those nobles. Sigh, let's not talk about it. Then let's do it this way, I will personally bow to you." At this point, the old man could not help but look at Amandina and Scarlet, and then asked, "But your servants can't go in with you. How about letting them wait here?" "Of course," Brando replied. Note 1, the core doctrine of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 532. There was a row of golden red pillars in the corridor, and the spiral pattern on the pillars was like a flame. The nun princess walked between the pillars in a hurry, and had to lift the hem of her white nun's robe. She was as innocent as an angel. After passing through the inner corridor of the Anderla Cathedral, Magadal saw Sir Benninger waiting for her in a small courtyard. Regardless of whether she admitted it or not, she had a good impression of this young man. Benninger was a man who could abandon his family background and stand on the side of love and justice. He knew that a man with such persistence would easily win people's favor no matter where he went. Besides, Benninger was exactly what she wanted to fight against fate, but she dared not imagine it. When she saw the young man, she could not help but feel nervous and shy. She asked softly, "Sir Benninger, why are you looking for me at this time?" "Her Highness wants to know the Holy Cathedral's stance." She knew it was a natural answer, but Magadal could not help but feel a little disappointed. "Still the same. The Archbishop hopes that the Holy Cathedral will maintain a neutral stance. Although Lord Icon likes you, he will definitely defend Archbishop Wood's decision. The Holy Cathedral is not biased. This is already the best news for us," Benninger replied. He only showed his obedient side in front of the princess. In front of others, this young man was also a smart noble. "What's wrong?" "The lion beast men are restless at the border. The princess is worried that the Holy Cathedral will want to end the civil war early." The nun princess frowned her beautiful eyebrows and replied softly, "No, Archbishop Wood would never support such a method. But there might be some changes in the Holy Cathedral. I received some news today. Archbishop Wood's term is almost up, and the Holy Cathedral has sent a successor. Together with the successor is a special envoy of the Holy Cathedral. I have a bad feeling about this, Sir Benninger. What is the name of the successor? Benninger's face was unreadable. I don't know, Sir Benninger. This is the Holy Cathedral's top secret. I shouldn't be discussing this with you. Magadol looked at the young man worriedly and said softly, You and Griffin are both outstanding people, but this world is too unfair. I'm sorry, even I can't help you. Magadol's face was flushed red as she jogged over. Even Benninger could not help but take a second look at her. The young man smiled and shook his head. It's nothing. Thank you very much, Princess Magadol. By the way, you seem to be in a hurry to come here. Did something happen over there? The young man was referring to the inner sanctum. That was a place where only the inner sanctum of the holy sanctum could enter. Although he was of noble birth and was now the special envoy of the princess, he was still not allowed to enter. Magadol blushed upon hearing his question and nodded. There are nobles who are here to become Knights of the Templar. As the priestess of the Templar, I am supposed to be a spectator. Benninger raised his eyebrows. He understood that the nun princess was implying that she had violated the rules of the holy sanctum because of him. This was already a big deal for the well-educated, quiet, and docile princess. Any man would be proud to hear such words, but the young knight did not show it. Instead he asked, Which family do you belong to, choosing to take office at this time of the year? I'm not sure. I heard that the person who introduced him was a big shot. Originally, he wanted the archbishop to help him with the ceremony. Archbishop? Benninger's face changed. He could not help but interrupt. Is it Archbishop Wood? Yes, but unfortunately the archbishop is not here. But that young man is also very powerful. He actually rejected Lord Zoya's suggestion. I can see that he really does not care about this honor. There are very few nobles who think this way, especially in Erewhon. The nun princess said with a sigh. I think he probably does not know how much honor he has missed out on. Benninger said in disbelief. He was slightly jealous. He actually rejected the archbishop's ceremony. What a great honor it was. Of course, he would rather believe that Brando was a country bumpkin who did not know what the archbishop's ceremony meant. The young knight took a deep breath and quickly realized that he had lost his composure. He shook his head and said, Then I shall take my leave, Your Highness. Benninger's loss of composure did not leave a bad impression in Magadol's eyes. Which young man could remain calm after hearing such a thing? Even the nun princess herself could not believe it, let alone the fact that she had a good impression of Benninger. His flaws had become his strengths. However, she still thought of something and could not help but ask, Mr. Benninger, I heard that you came with someone else? Benninger was about to leave when he heard Magadol's question. He could not help but be startled. Yes, I came with Marquis Yoakum. I met him on the way and did not expect him to recognize me. He is the princess's uncle in name, so I could not reject him. Yes, Magadol nodded her head gently and hesitated before advising, Yoakum? Marquis Yoakum has a bad reputation and he is very close to Prince Luku. If possible, Mr. Benninger, you should try to keep a distance from him to avoid being maligned. Marquis Yoakum was Oberg VII's cousin in name, but he was the illegitimate son of the previous king and did not have the right to inherit the throne. As if to resist this fate, the Marquis was born to be unrestrained. He had a very bad reputation in the noble circle, and even had bad intentions towards his only niece. Recently, he had been hanging out with Prince Luku, the elder brother of the princess. Everyone knew that he had an unspeakable relationship with the eldest daughter of the Cipher family. Magadol had a weak personality, but she hated people like him. She had heard that Benninger was hanging out with such people, so she could not help but remind him. I understand. The young man smiled at her. Thank you, Your Highness. No need. The nun princess shook her head. She watched the young man leave and his figure disappear from the side hall. She could not help but sigh. She secretly left her post and did not know if she should be happy or worried. In the eyes of the world, she was a quiet and obedient princess, and once she left, the old fogies of the temple would most likely reprimand her. However, Magadol's heart was filled with both disappointment and excitement. This was the first time she had gone against her own rules. Although it was just a small step, she could not help but feel her heart pounding wildly. The nun princess turned around and walked back with a resolute aura as if she was facing the execution ground. On the other side, the young Benninger could not help but ask his servant, Where is Marquis Yoakum? The servant was a little scared as he replied, I don't know, my lord. Marquis Yoakum said that he had not been to the Anderla Cathedral before, so he went in alone. That damn playboy. Benninger's face darkened as he gritted his teeth. My lord, should we wait for him? The servant asked carefully. Why should we wait for him? Benninger asked. He can do whatever he wants. I hope he doesn't cause too much trouble. Let's go back to the manor. Her Highness is still waiting for our news. Yes, my lord. The servant quickly bowed and replied. In the quiet room of Anderla Cathedral. The ceremony for becoming a Templar Knight was much simpler than expected. Among the 4 holy cathedrals, the Holy Cathedral of Fire inherited the style of the Flame King, Gretel. The ceremony for becoming a Templar Knight usually started with the person performing the ceremony asking some questions. These questions could be the reason why the person wanted to join the ranks of the Templar Knight, or some knowledge related to the doctrine. Brando was well prepared and had already leveled up his religious knowledge, Erwin, to level 10. At this moment, when the old priest asked the question, the answer naturally appeared in his mind. The more the old priest asked, the more satisfied he was. Ever since the end of the First Holy War and the Year of the Cave Beasts, the nobles' respect for the Golden Flame had become more and more apparent. Although the Holy Cathedral was still authoritative, the ancient virtues no longer existed in people's hearts. The struggle for power and money was getting more and more intense, and the nobles pursued methods more than faith. A young man who could have such views on the doctrine of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was rare even among the people of Cruz, let alone Erwin. He could not help but nod and said to Brando, "If it wasn't for your reluctance, I would really like you to join the Holy Cathedral. I think you will definitely become a true holy knight. You are clear-headed and clean. I have traveled to many places, and you are the most outstanding young man I have ever seen." Brando could not help but blush a little. He did not expect the old priest to think so highly of him. The title of Holy Knight in the Holy Cathedral of Fire was even higher than the Knight of the Temple, and its status was almost the same as the position of the regional archbishop. Brando knew that as long as he nodded, it was likely that the old priest would recommend him to that step. A holy knight enjoyed unimaginable power and status in Erewhon. For example, Archbishop Wood's status could be said to be superior and equal to that of the king. Brando would be lying if he said that he was not moved for a moment, but that was not his intention. If he joined the Holy Cathedral of Fire, he would have to accept the arrangements of the headquarters and would not be able to interfere in Erewhon's affairs. Besides, the Holy Cathedral of Fire was not as clean as it appeared to be. Brando knew this better than anyone else, so he still shook his head to express his refusal. What a pity. The old priest sighed, but he was just excited to see an outstanding young man. He picked up the pebble dipped in holy water and placed it on Brando. He pressed one hand on the doctrine of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and was ready to swear the oath of office for Brando. But at this moment, a person suddenly walked out of the inner hall and stopped the old priest. Wait. Brando and the priest turned around and found that it was Archbishop Wood. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 533. Hold on. Archbishop Wood's sudden appearance startled the elderly priest. He quickly stopped what he was doing and looked at him with some confusion. Priest Zoya, I have something to say to this young man. Can you leave for a moment? The current Archbishop of the Anderla Cathedral did not even look at Brendel. He looked at his colleague and asked. The elderly priest was stunned, but then lowered his eyelids, put his hand in front of his chest and bowed slightly. Of course, as you wish, Archbishop. He glanced at Brando and then looked at Archbishop Wood's face. He could not figure out the relationship between them, but it was not something he could care about now. The elderly priest could only put away his curiosity and leave the room. Only then did Wood turn his head and look back. He felt a slightly stern gaze on him. Brando knew that things were not going well. The Archbishop of Anderla Cathedral spoke so harshly that it did not seem like he was here to invite him for afternoon tea. Besides, it was neither noon nor afternoon. I heard that your name is Brando? The Archbishop, who was second only to Erwin, spoke. Brando felt his eyebrows twitch slightly as if he had been pricked by a needle. He looked up and pretended to be puzzled. Well, your reaction is very alert and your expression is very realistic. But unfortunately, Tumen has already told me. Didn't he tell you about his relationship with me? Wood's serious expression suddenly turned into a smile. He shook his head. The young man in front of him, whom his old friend had mentioned to him not long ago, was acting cautiously at the moment. But to him, who already knew the details of the other party, he could not help but feel a little awkward. Wood's words made Brando freeze, and then he cursed in his heart. How could he forget the relationship between the powerful Archbishop of Ampere Seal and Tumen? In the Amber Sword, the two met in Cruz in the early years and were close friends. Later, even when Tumen lived in seclusion on the outskirts of Brags, the two did not break off contact, because Tumen often sent letters to Ampere Seal. But what surprised Brando was Tumen's attitude towards him. Although he had met the great scholar in Brags before, the only friendship they had was the experience of fighting the waves together in the loop of trade winds. Even though he could see that William and Tolman had a good impression of him, it was just a matter of getting along well with each other. He did not expect that William would go straight to his old friends in Ampere Seal after he asked for their help in writing a letter of introduction. The former was just a matter of convenience, while the latter was intentional. There was a big difference between the two. With Tumen's position in Erewhon, it seemed that he would not have any intention of doing anything to a small force in Tonajal. Before Brando could figure out the relationship between the two parties, Wood had already seen through his doubts. The Archbishop stared at Brando as if he wanted to see through him. "You don't have to think too much. My old friend seems to admire you. Ever since he left the core of the kingdom's power, this is the first time I've seen him so enthusiastic." "Do you know what he said to me?" Of course, Brando did not know, but he was also very curious why the famous master of the Mithril fortress would take the long way to become the leader of the tower. He simply looked at the Archbishop of the Anderla Cathedral calmly and shook his head. "I don't know, Archbishop." He said so, admitting his identity. This time, it was Archbishop Wood's turn to be curious. "Young man, since I already know your identity, you should know that you are a rebel, and I represent the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Do you really think that I will let you go just because you are an old friend?" When the elderly Archbishop asked this, he subconsciously revealed the majesty of a high-ranking clergyman of the Holy Cathedral. If an ordinary person was faced with such an interrogation, they would have been trembling in fear. But Brando had a clear conscience and replied calmly, "I don't know, but I would rather believe that you have a reason for telling me so much here. My old friend thinks that you can help Erewhon out of the quagmire." Archbishop Wood replied. Brando's fingers twitched slightly. This was an answer that he would never have dreamed of. He took a deep breath and did not know how to answer for a moment. If he answered accordingly, it would seem a little too arrogant because even he could not see the path of history clearly. He never thought that what he was doing now was so great because rather than saving, it was more like making up for the regrets of the past. Brando even felt that his starting point was a little selfish. He hoped that the good things that had been lost in the past could be preserved, like a child who had done something wrong looking back to make up for his mistakes. Although it was not his fault, Brando always felt a sense of guilt. He knew too much but could do too little. The only answer he could give himself was to do his best. Even for this trip to Ampere Seal, Her Royal Highness, who had worked so hard for Erewhon in another period of history, was on the other side of the fog, but whether he could pass through it was still unknown. Brando took every step carefully, and only he knew how careful he was. But until today someone had said to him with certainty, "I think you can help Erewhon out of the quagmire." And this person was not an ordinary person who spoke without thinking, but a wise old man. He was the master of the Mithril fortress, Erewhon's great scholar, the Silver Folk, and one of the many craftsman wizards who stood at the top of the clouds. Brando felt that the old man was not so bored as to joke with him, and the joke was so coincidental. Brando suddenly felt a little dry in his mouth, but after all, Tumen was not a prophet. This old man might have seen some signs with his wise eyes, but Brando felt that it was better to be humble. But if he blindly denied it, it would seem that he did not have enough confidence. He looked at the Archbishop of Anderla and finally nodded. "I believe that any ambitious young man would have such thoughts about this decaying kingdom. Not only me, there are many people who are fighting for this goal. So am I. It's just that I try my best to do what I think is right, that's all." "So what you did in Tonajal is also part of the answer?" Brando nodded. Wood lowered his eyelids, walked to Brando and motioned him to kneel down. "Do you know that the Lion Beastmen in the north are ready to make a move?" Brando looked at the Archbishop's action. He was going to perform the Knight of the Templars profession transfer ceremony for him. For a moment he could not figure out what the Archbishop was thinking. In the history of the Amber Sword, Wood was known for his impartiality. He was known as the priest of iron and majesty. However, his reputation was mostly positive. He acted according to the virtues of the Holy Temple and was a truly admirable clergyman. Brando reacted after a slight pause. He hurriedly knelt on one knee like a knight receiving a title. Although he didn't have a good impression of this kind of ceremony, he understood that this was a rare opportunity. At the same time, he nodded and replied in a low voice, "I know a little. The sanctum will not allow Erewhon to make a move for too long." Wood put his hand on Brando's shoulder and recited, "In the name of Gretel, the Flame King, his descendants will always be proud of this name, not because of the achievements of the ancestors, but because of the character and virtue that they have inherited. Therefore we swear that no matter what happens, his descendants will always hold on to this belief in their hearts. I swear, Brendel replied according to the rules. On one hand, he was not worried about the lion beastman's restlessness. It was something that happened in history, and it was like a nail that was nailed into a board. In comparison, the voice of the Iron Face officiant reciting the ancient oath sounded even more sacred. Even Brando felt some resonance in his heart. Yes, these values were so precious in the Dark Ages, but now Wonde has abandoned them and only a few people still hold on to them. Then we ask that this young knight will not change his oath because of any changes in the environment. No matter what the situation is, he should understand that there are some things in this world that are always right, and should not be abandoned or forgotten. I promise. Just as the two of them were answering each other, the space in the quiet room seemed to be turbulent. Brando felt as if some kind of connection had been established, like a bridge that descended from the sky at the moment he made the oath, connecting one end of the world to the other end of the unknown. The laws that maintained the foundation of the world of the Amber Sword resonated, and a majestic power descended from the sky and merged into his body. As if he had received some kind of recognition, he instantly gained the ability of a Templar Knight. System notification. Player has received a new profession, Templar Knight. System notification. Player has received a new profession skill, Conflict Aura. System notification. Player has received a new profession skill, Blood of the Sun. System notification. Player has received a new profession skill, Crown of Thorns. The blessing of an officiant was indeed extraordinary. Brando instantly gained 15 levels of Templar Knight for free, and at the same time he also gained a new profession skill when he reached level 5 and 15. There was no need to introduce Conflict Aura, and Blood of the Sun and Crown of Thorns were also one of the core skills of a Templar Knight. P.S. You bad people are secretly saying bad things about me in the group again. Don't think that I didn't see it. I just had something to do during the day and I'm not going to update anymore. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 534. Blood of the Scorching Sun was a passive skill. Any enemy that dealt melee damage to a Templar Knight would receive 5% of the damage dealt per level. At level 15, the damage dealt would reach 75%. Although this damage was also considered magic damage and fire damage, which could be offset by various resistances, it was still enough to give a Templar's opponent a headache. After all, a Templar was a tank-type class. If you slashed at a Templar, you might end up receiving more damage than the Templar. Crown of Thorns, on the other hand, was an active offensive skill. This skill had two states, continuous and active. When it was in effect, it consumed less mana per second. Its purpose was to increase the Templar Knight's own endurance and resistance. Endurance referred to immunity to poison and special damage, while resistance referred to immunity to magic. Once a Templar Knight actively activated this skill, all his defense, resistance and endurance would be converted into attack power for a short period of time. This period of time was very short, and after the effect ended, the Templar Knight would have a long period of weakness with 0 defense and 0 resistance. However, during the duration of this skill, the Templar Knight's combat power would be increased by 200%. Players jokingly called it Mad Dog Mode. This skill was the core of the Templar Knight's explosive power. In fact, Brando had never liked this kind of skill, but it was definitely an unexpected surprise to be able to draw 2 core skills from the vast number of skills available in each profession. This was also one of the powers of a high-ranking cleric presiding over the ceremony. Brando could not help but glance at Archbishop Wood. The Archbishop, who stood at the peak of power in the Anderla Cathedral, did not have much of an expression on his face. In fact, the whole ceremony only lasted for a moment. Then the old man nodded to him and said, "You may rise." The restless law in the quiet room seemed to have quieted down in an instant. The previous feeling of divine power filling the room was now gone. It was as if everything before was just an illusion. The lion beastmen of Toquinen in the north are ready to make a move. The Holy Cathedral will not allow Erwin to cause trouble for too long. My term is coming to an end, and the Holy Cathedral may send a new high priest to replace me. Wood waited for Brando to stand up and continued the previous topic. He didn't seem to care about hosting the class change ceremony for Brando, and the focus of the conversation was repeatedly on this matter. When Brando heard this, he suddenly took it seriously. He knew that the archbishop had always advocated that the Holy Cathedral should be independent from the affairs of the other countries and maintain a detached attitude. This was also the case when it came to the internal strife in Awen. Did the archbishop suddenly mention this to him to say that his successor might not be on the same page as him? Thinking of this, he could not help but look suspiciously at this powerful figure. Archbishop Wood was non-committal. "I heard that you support Erwin's princess?" the old man asked. Brando did not avoid this and only nodded. "The princess is weak now. If she wants to rule Awen, I'm afraid this kingdom will fall into a long period of turmoil. Unless she can persuade Duke Erek, then the originally wavering Vero and Radner will lean towards the royal faction." The old man's eyes fell on Brando. "But do you think this can really help this ancient kingdom?" Brando shook his head. This was exactly what he wanted to stop. He could clearly see how things would develop in the future. Once the princess reached an agreement with Erek, she would have no choice but to compromise with the conservative nobles. The royal faction around her was unreliable, just like the pillars in this crumbling house had already rotted from the inside. No matter how they replaced the pillars, it would not be of any help. Perhaps it could save the situation for a while, but in the long run, it would be of no help. Brando was not a prophet, but he had seen all this play out with his own eyes. It was like the rise and fall of a stage play, but he was in it. The Archbishop of Anderla Cathedral looked at him again. "So, you understand?" Brando suddenly realized that this was what the Archbishop wanted to say. The Holy Cathedral would not let the civil strife in Erwin drag on for too long, and once the princess could not gain the upper hand in a short time, the Holy Cathedral was likely to intervene. Although Wood himself did not advocate this, there was no guarantee that his successor would do the same. Thinking of this, he could not help but look up at the old man. "Tolman is my old friend, and Erwin is also his homeland. He does not want to see his homeland fall, so I naturally have to help him. Besides, this does not contradict my views. Young man, my old friend has bet part of his chips on you, so I don't mind staying in Ampere-Seal for a while longer. But time is limited, and the Holy Cathedral is not something I can control. At most, I will try to buy some time." He looked at Brando and said, "There is not much time left for you. From today I can see that you are a smart person. I believe you can understand what I mean." Brando took a deep breath and finally understood the relationship between the two. However, he did not expect Tolman to have the Holy Cathedral of Ampere-Seal on his side. Although the time was short, it was a great advantage for his actions. This surprise really fell from the sky, and it was even bigger than when he got the Paradise of Adversity card set. He nodded to Archbishop Wood and said, "I understand. It's good that you understand. To the outside world, just use your original excuse. You should know that if the reputation of the Holy Cathedral is tarnished, the revenge that will follow is not something your territory can bear. Even Erwin is the same." The Archbishop said expressionlessly. Brando was of course aware of this. He did not want to alarm this important person, but he did not expect Tolman to have arranged everything early. Brando remembered that he did not talk much with William and the great scholar in the loop of trade winds. However, the great scholar was indeed the former leader of the Silver Alliance. He guessed his intentions with just a little clue. But Brando was more curious about what the great scholar thought of him. If the great scholar really thought that he could save Erwin, then he only needed to stand on his side. With the great scholar's influence, the princess's side could at least obtain the same power as the many nobles in the north. However, the great scholar chose to help from the side. What was he trying to do? Was it because he said that the silver folk were not willing to intervene in the affairs of the mortals? Brando felt that this might not be the case. Otherwise, the future wizards would not be fighting over the ancient slate. In the end, Brando stayed for about half an hour in the quiet room of the Anderla Cathedral for the Templar Knight's profession change. This was because the process of a Templar Knight's profession change took about this long. In addition to the ceremony itself, the priest who presided over the ceremony would also ask the knight some questions after the profession change. But would skip this step and only talk to Brendel about the situation in Awen. Brendel was not too worried about the Lion Beast men and their successors, especially when Wood reminded him of the speculations about the Lion Beast men and their successors, because he knew what would happen in the future. In history, the change of the Diocese of Ampere-Seal would at least have to wait until next year. The Lion Beast men of Toquinen would not dare to easily invade the territory in the short term unless there was a change in history. However, in fact, his impact on the whole history was not as big as he thought. At least, Brando did not think that what he had done before could affect Erwin or even some of the decisions of the Holy Cathedral. This was a little too ridiculous. After half an hour, Brando bid farewell to the Archbishop of Amberlight and left. In fact, he did not mind staying here for a while, but staying here for too long would arouse suspicion. Besides, although the idea of becoming a Templar Knight had come to him when he was in the suburbs of Fortress Reden, it was after all just an interlude in his many plans. Next, Brando was preparing to go to the largest auction house in Amberlight. He still had a painting of Princess Anyao that he had not sold yet. This art piece was priceless in the eyes of those who knew its value, but for someone like Brando who had no artistic talent, it was just equivalent to the funds needed for the future development of his territory. If he told others about this idea, he would probably be called the most vulgar noble in Erewhon the next day, even worse than the nouveau riche. Fortunately, Brando never thought of himself as a noble. The so-called noble identity was nothing more than an excuse for him to hide his actions. But what troubled Brando was that the auction house in Amberlight was just like other noble gatherings. Without a certain status, it was impossible to participate in that circle. He knew that the owner of the auction house was a member of the Chamber of Commerce in Amberlight, a middle-aged man called Donner. He had a title and name, but this gentleman was very rich and it was not easy to meet him. Besides, the other party had his own way of collecting auction items, and it was not easy for Brando to participate in it. He did not know much about the affairs of the noble circle, and was about to ask Amandina who was waiting outside. In their group, probably only this noble lady knew more about the nobles in Erewhon. But before he could walk out into the courtyard, he heard a woman's angry voice. "Sir, please show some respect, this is the Holy Cathedral of Fire." Brando was stunned, and subconsciously thought that the two ladies who came with him were in trouble. But after listening carefully, he realized that he did not recognize this woman's voice. He could not help but be slightly stunned. Who was outside? Where did Amandina and Scarlet go? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 535. Sir, please show some respect. This is the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Princess Magadol pulled her hand back and frowned at the middle-aged man. This middle-aged man's face was pale, and his loose eye bags were faintly purplish-black. He looked like he had drunk too much. He was wearing exquisite knitted clothes, and it was obvious that he was of noble birth. However, his footsteps were light and his eyes were blurred. Even his collar buttons were not properly buttoned, revealing his pale, bony collarbone and ribs. The first impression he gave was that he was one of those unrestrained debauches. When Brando walked out of the room, he saw this scene. In fact, he knew what was going on. Marquis Joachim, the cousin of Oberg VII, and the illegitimate son of the previous king. He was much younger than Oberg VII, and although he had a fief, his status was very subtle. Therefore he indulged in sensual pleasures and indulged in debauchery. It was said that he was a womanizer, and had affairs with many of the ladies in the upper circle of nobles. However, he was close to Prince Lu Ku and the princess's brother, the current king's eldest son, and had the support of the current mistress of House Cipher. Normal nobles could not do anything to him. Even though he did not know why the Marquis was here, he could guess what was going on as long as he was here. At this time, Marquis Joachim noticed him first, and turned his head like a poisonous snake. "I think this gentleman must be the owner of the two beautiful ladies. I wonder if you are willing to transfer them to me?" Filthy words. Magadol was very well-mannered, and even in such a situation she was able to control herself. However, her chest was heaving up and down, and it was obvious that she was very angry. She could not help but interrupt. "This is the Holy Cathedral, and the ancestors are watching us from the dome of the cathedral. Please mind your words and actions, sir." The nun princess tightly clenched her fists, secretly wondering how such a suspicious person managed to sneak into the sacred palace. "Princess Magadol, don't worry about others. Do you know who I am?" Marquis Joachim replied with a smile. "I am the uncle of the future king of this kingdom. I think you should have heard of my name. I've admired your name for a long time. Now that I've seen you, your reputation is indeed well deserved. TSK. I must obtain a famous flower like you at all costs." Magadol gritted her teeth. She had been educated by the Holy Cathedral since she was a child. She had always been quiet and gentle, and all the people she had interacted with were polite and knowledgeable people. She had never met such a shameless person. She was so angry that her whole body trembled, but she didn't know how to fight back. At this time, Brando finally interrupted. "Forgive me for not understanding, sir. But I would like to ask, where are my two maids now?" He looked around but did not see Amandina and Scarlet. Thinking of the Marquis' reputation, he suddenly had a bad premonition. Oh, they dared to speak rudely to me, so I ordered one of my men to teach them a lesson. But you can rest assured that I will not harm the lives of the beauties. It's just that the red-haired beauty did not know what's good for her, so Kagbo accidentally injured her. Actually, it's not a big deal. Since you're going to hand them over to me soon, isn't it natural for a noble to teach his maids a lesson? Marquis Yoakum said casually, as if the one who ordered the attack was not him, but Brando. Sir, you don't have to worry too much. Your female companions are injured, but I've already ordered them to be treated. Magadal screamed before she could finish her sentence. She saw a silver light fly past Marquis Yoakum's face. It was a silver dagger. Marquis Yoakum did not expect Brando to be so fast. Even the guards behind him did not react in time, and there was a bloody cut on his face. The middle-aged man screamed and sucked in a breath of cold air at the same time. For a moment he even forgot to throw a tantrum. Instead, he covered his bloody face and screamed at the top of his lungs, "How dare you attack a noble? How dare you violate the laws of the Holy Cathedral?" The nun Princess Magadal was stunned. In the core terms of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the ancient nobles were protected. Although they would be punished for their mistakes, if anyone dared to harm them secretly, it would be a heinous crime. As a result, most of the fights between nobles had to come up with all sorts of dignified excuses. Of course, there was no lack of people using poison and assassination in the dark. However, these were generally shady activities, and no one had ever dared to do so openly in the Holy Cathedral. Magadal was afraid that Brando would do something reckless in a moment of anger, but she did not expect that she was still a step too late. For a moment she could not help but stare at Brando, but only saw the coldness in the young man's eyes. Brando had never been a good-tempered person. No one had ever dared to talk about hurting his subordinates in front of him so casually. Not to mention as a man who dared to hurt a girl. As a male chauvinist, Brando absolutely could not accept Marquis Yoakum's way of doing things. In his eyes, this guy belonged to the category of existence that needed to be taught a lesson. "You really know how to accuse me, my lord?" Brando replied coldly, "Did I attack you?" "You clearly." Marquis Yoakum suddenly turned his head. The dagger that Brando threw earlier was embedded in the pillar behind the courtyard, almost to the hilt, and a white glove was nailed to the dagger. "You?" Marquis Yoakum was a little stunned. He only just noticed that Brando had taken off a glove at some point. From the moment he took off the glove to throwing the dagger, no one saw the entire action clearly. What kind of strength was this? He looked up at Brando. "You want to duel with me? Do you know who I am?" "Who are you?" Brando had already decided to teach him a lesson, but on the surface he pretended to be stunned. "I'm the cousin of the former king. The uncle of the current king. You damned country bumpkin." Marquis Yoakum roared angrily. His status was special, and the old king had spoiled him greatly when he was still alive. Since he had no interest in the throne, Oberg VII had also let his cousin do whatever he wanted. As a result, he had a lot of privileges, and in the noble circle of Owen, other than a few high-ranking dukes, no one dared to provoke him. Of course, Marquis Yoakum was not stupid enough to find trouble with those powerful Grand Dukes. Therefore, in his decades of debauchery he had almost never encountered any setbacks. Even if he was injured, it was only a few times. But this was the first time he was injured by an outsider. Marquis Yoakum could not help but look at Brando with hatred and said coldly, "You're dead meat." Brando seemed to be startled at this time. "You said you're the uncle of the current king. Are you that Marquis Yoakum?" "That's right." "So, country bumpkin, do you still want to duel with me? But it's too late for you to repent now. I'll let you know what hell is. Your women, I'll let them witness how you'll beg for mercy in front of them." Yoakum laughed cruelly, thinking that Brendel was afraid. "But it's too late for you to repent now. I'll show you what hell is. Marquis Yoakum, watch your words." The nun princess finally reacted at this time. At this time she had already made up her mind to help Brando. Although she did not know the identity of this young man, Marquis Yoakum's actions really made her want to vomit. And as the princess of a duchy, and at the same time having a close relationship with the Holy Cathedral, Magadal still had a certain amount of influence in this ancient kingdom. But at this time, Brando secretly cursed in his heart. He did not think that Marquis Yoakum would really climb up the pole. Although he had already heard a lot of rumors about Marquis Yoakum and the Amber Sword, he did not expect to see the extent of Marquis Yoakum's stupidity. Looking at this guy with bulging veins, he could not help but feel a little sad that this was the stupidest opponent he had ever met since he transmigrated to this world. "You're already a few decades old, can you not act like a Chinibu? Can you not be so melodramatic? Brando could not help but shake his head. He stopped Magadol and said casually, "No, I think you have misunderstood Marquis Yoakum. Of course I do not dare to duel with you. I heard that you are a trash in the noble circle. Dueling with you would only ruin my reputation." As soon as Brando said this, the courtyard suddenly became quiet. The breeze from the sea to the west of Amberlight brushed past, and the flowers and trees in the courtyard rustled. The nun princess, Marquis Yoakum, and his men all stopped and looked at the young man in shock. It was as if they were hallucinating. Marquis Yoakum took a long time to realize that Brendel was mocking him, and the arrogant noble almost went mad with anger. He immediately roared without any grace, "Kagbo, go and fight him." In Erewhon and Cruz, the nobles had long been eroded by their luxurious lifestyle. It was no longer like 100 years ago when everyone had excellent swordsmanship. However, duels were still popular among the upper nobles. In order to deal with love rivals, opponents, or other challenges, the nobles often let their personal attendants fight on their behalf. It was already one of the recognized rules, so there was nothing wrong with Marquis Yoakum's order at this moment. Brando had no attendants by his side at this moment, so he had to draw his sword himself. He looked up and immediately saw a tall swordsman walking out from behind Marquis Yoakum. Brando secretly focused. Although he had angered Marquis Yoakum and tried to make him attack him, he did not have the slightest intention of underestimating him. From Marquis Yoakum's description, Scarlet should have been injured by his subordinate. Although Scarlet's combat skills were not as good, she was still at the peak of the gold rank. For him to be able to take her down so easily, he should at least have the strength of an elemental awakener. Speaking of elemental awakeners, Erewhon only had a few people who had this strength. When he saw the swordsman walk out, he recognized him at a glance. It was him, Devard the Eagle, the man who was as famous as Buga the Cross and Sylvia the Silver Knight, was known as one of the 3 great swordsmen of Erech. However, this person was different from Buga. He and Sylvia both served Duke Erech. Why would he appear beside Marquis Yoakum at this moment? Brando was slightly stunned. I originally wanted to release 2 chapters, but something came up at the last minute. I will release 1 chapter first. Love everyone in the group. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 536. Devard walked out from behind Marquis Yoakum. He had inherited the long face and high cheekbones of the people of Erech. However, his fingers were a quarter longer than the average person's. As the saying goes, a person with a strange appearance is a strange person. Devard the Eagle was one of the 3 most famous swordsmen in the Erech province. In his early years he studied under the famous master swordsman Olaf. Later on he surpassed his master and created his own eagle strike sword style. Devard used a long narrow sword that was good for stabbing. When attacking, it was as cunning as a venomous snake, which coincided with his swordsmanship. I wonder what this person's intentions are with Marquis Yoakum under the alias of Kagbo? Brando thought for a moment and raised his sword. However, Princess Magadol pulled him back and said, "Sir, this person has the strength of an elemental awakener. I'm afraid you are no match for him." Brando already knew the identity of the nun beside him. Hearing her words, he couldn't help but have a good impression of her. He had long heard that the nun princess was gentle and kind. She had once taken in a large number of refugees in the name of the Holy Cathedral during Aween's civil strife. Unfortunately, the good did not have good karma. It was said that her final fate was extremely miserable, and it seemed that she was poisoned to death by her own husband. How do you know I'm not a match for him? Brendel sighed inwardly at the fate of a beautiful woman. You. The princess' beautiful brown eyes widened. She thought to herself, this person doesn't know what's good for him. She was clearly worried about him. Devard waved his sword and said impatiently, "Are you ready?" "Wait." The nun princess stopped him. She turned her head and stared at Marquis Yoakum, who was covering his bloody face. Marquis Yoakum ordered his servants to fight on his behalf. However, we are going to fight in person. According to the rules of the nobles, this gentleman can ask for more stakes. Marquis Yoakum gritted his teeth and stretched out his left hand. A servant beside him carefully ran over and removed a ring from his hand. The Marquis nodded and gestured for the servant to bring the ring over. "All right, this is my wager. Shall we begin the duel now?" he asked, glaring at Magadol and Brando like a venomous snake. Brando did not know that there was such a thing in the duel between nobles. He was slightly startled, but the hidden soul in his body immediately occupied the surface of his personality. With Sophie's character of taking advantage of every opportunity, of course, she would not be so generous as to let go of any benefits. When he saw the ring that Marquis Joachim took out, his eyes lit up slightly. The snake curl ring. This guy was worthy of being a member of the royal family. He had some good stuff on him. Lord Marquis is so impressive, a ring is so expensive. But Brando pretended not to know the value of the ring and sneered. Princess Magadol could not help but cough slightly, and her face was a little red. The snake curl ring of Marquis Joachim was the work of the dwarf rune master Pino. It was priceless. It was rumored that although this marquis did not have a good reputation, he was very generous. There was no rumor that he was stingy, and there were many people who spent money like it was water. Now it seemed that it was true. Marquis Joachim was almost driven mad by Brando. He could not help but snort coldly, "This is a magic ring. It can block a fatal attack for you. Do you know its value, country bumpkin?" Brando's face was full of, "So that's how it is?" Marquis Joachim took a deep breath and felt that he would die from anger if he continued to talk to this guy. He simply threw out a bag and a pile of shiny gold coins spilled out of the bag. But Marquis Joachim did not care about the money at all. He just scolded, "Then this is enough to buy your life, bumpkin?" The bag of gold coins was at least 100,000 Tor coins. Brando thought to himself that this was a fat sheep, but he immediately nodded, indicating that it was enough. Marquis Joachim scolded in his heart again. Princess Magadol felt her face turn red, but she still said calmly, "My side has said that there is no problem." Then, as the witness, I announced that the duel can begin. A duel is a noble's etiquette. I hope that both parties will adhere to their status as gentlemen and promise to abstain from any despicable acts during the duel. No sneak attacks, no poison, no mercy, and no killing. The nun princess's voice was gentle. She was probably the most gentle and anti-violence witness in Erewhon's history. At this moment, Brando and Devard, who went by the pseudonym Cagbo, raised their swords and swore. Both of them knew that this was just a formality. There had never been a duel between nobles that did not involve bloodshed. Once the duel began, the nobles would tear away the last of their gentleness. Devard put down his sword and signaled Brando to make the first move. As a master of a sect, although he was using a pseudonym, he did not put down the airs of a master. His opponent was just a young boy. If he were to make the first move, this famous eagle swordsman did not think that he could afford to lose face. However, Brando did not have such concerns. With the mentality that he would be a bastard if he did not take advantage of the situation, he immediately assumed an offensive stance. Military swordsmanship. Devard snorted contemptuously in his heart. Brando's sword went straight for Devard's heart. His modified military swordsmanship was extremely murderous, and every strike was aimed to take a life. Devard blocked with his long sword, and the two swords clashed in mid-air. Brando held the hilt of his sword with both hands and slashed diagonally at Devard's sword. The eagle swordsman immediately felt that something was wrong. There was no such dangerous fighting style in the military swordsmanship. However, his decades of swordsmanship experience were not for nothing. With a flick of his sword, he managed to separate his sword from Brando's attack. He took a step back and frowned slightly. After one exchange, he was actually on the defensive side. His opponent's military swordsmanship was extremely strange to him. However, before he could figure out his next move, his heart suddenly tightened. His experience turned into a sense of crisis and made him react. He saw that after Brando's sword was deflected, Brando was charging towards his chest. The eagle swordsman felt a chill in his heart. He subconsciously pulled out a short sword with his left hand and placed it in front of his throat. Brando was close to him, and with a clang of metal, Devard's left hand trembled slightly. There was a shallow line of blood on the short sword in his hand and on his neck. Devard felt a chill run down his spine. His opponent was crazy. This was a battle of life and death. Fortunately, he reacted quickly. However, in his decades of fighting experience, he had never fought such a battle. The eagle swordsman was not a soldier and had never fought on the battlefield. Naturally, he did not understand the difference between life and death on the battlefield. The life and death of a swordsman was glory, while the life of a soldier was just a consumable. Brando's swordsmanship was extremely decisive. It was as if his entire body had turned into a sharp sword, exuding a terrifying aura. Not only Devard, but even Marquis Joachim and Magadol's expressions changed. At this moment they felt as if they were not watching a duel, but a battle of life and death between soldiers on both sides. This swordsmanship is so vicious. Marquis Joachim could not help but touch his neck. At this moment, Devard was completely provoked by Brando. It was as if he was a beast that had been forced into a desperate situation. As a swordsman, he had never thought that he would come to this point. He felt a sense of powerlessness. His previous swordsmanship was useless in such a battle. It was as if he could only rely on his instincts to win in such a battle. The eagle swordsman's palms were covered in a layer of sweat. This was something that had never happened before. However, even in a desperate situation, the eagle swordsman's reaction was faster than the average soldier. His eagle swordsmanship was originally a long and short swordsmanship. The short sword in his left hand slashed downwards to force Brando away from his side, while the long sword in his right hand pierced out desperately. Devard heaved a sigh of relief. When Brando retreated, he immediately pressed forward with his sword. But in the next moment, the eagle swordsman could not help but sweat profusely. He saw that Brando had used his left hand to block his sword. The back of his left hand was immediately lacerated, revealing a deep wound. But he still took a step forward and slashed his sword straight towards his ribs. Devard could tell that if the sword landed, the blade would pass through between his 7th and 8th ribs, causing severe damage to his lungs. Devard finally lost his spirit. A silver mirror suddenly appeared in the path of Brando's sword. Sparks flew everywhere as Brando's sword heavily struck the silver mirror. A circle of ripples appeared on the surface of the silver mirror. It was like mercury, but after the ripples passed, not even a shallow mark was left. Next, a series of flashes formed a sphere with Devard as the center. Upon closer inspection, it was a silver convex mirror. These silver mirrors flashed and disappeared, forming a hemispherical defense around the eagle swordsman. Passive elemental power. Brando had long known that Devard's elemental power was the silver wall. The passive elemental power of this elemental power was somewhat similar to the fire shield. It would automatically defend the elemental power from external physical attacks. Of course, this was not an absolute defense. As long as the attacker's strength exceeded the elemental power's limit, this layer of defense could be easily broken. This passive elemental power could provide a considerable advantage in a battle of the same level. It was almost invincible in a battle of the same level. Devard had finally used this elemental power. In fact, this already showed that he was inferior to Brando in swordsmanship. If this was a contest of swordsmanship, then Devard would have already lost. But unfortunately, this was a duel. Only then did Devard have the time to wipe his sweat. When he touched his forehead, he realized that it was covered in cold sweat. He looked up at Brando, unable to believe that this youth who was much younger than him had such superior swordsmanship. It was clearly military swordsmanship, but it was not. When he was young, he had been taught by the sword Saint Darius. He had seen the legendary sword saint's modified military swordsmanship. But this youth's military swordsmanship was even better. When he used his sword, it was as if he was on the battlefield. To enter the battlefield with the sword, this was the domain of the sword saint. Devard stared at Brando and could not help but ask, "Who are you?" Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 537. It's none of your business. Brando was not in the mood to answer Devard's question. He put down his sword and his aura changed. The strength of a gold pinnacle made everyone's expression change. Princess Magadal and Marquis Yoakum had seen Scarlet's strength before. She was at the pinnacle of gold pinnacle, but now she was an upper gold pinnacle at such a young age. Even the nun princess had doubts in her heart. Who was this young man? No wonder Archbishop would had to personally greet him. Marquis Yoakum had to be serious. It was not strange for a noble family to have a gold ranker as a servant, but for a young child to have such strength, he had to be cautious. He quietly made a gesture to Devard, hinting him not to kill. A family that could cultivate a gold ranker at such a young age would not be weak. The eyes of the Marquis flashed, but the cold expression on his face did not change. He was determined to teach Brando an unforgettable lesson. An upper gold ranker against an elemental awakening. In fact, Brando had reached upper gold ranker because he had just obtained a level 15 Templar Knight. However, he did not hesitate. This time he did not use military swordsmanship. Brando first used the charge skill and his whole body turned into a phantom. This terrifying speed made Devard's scalp tingle, but he immediately recognized that this was the special skill of the Sun Knight. He immediately held his breath and raised both his swords. Speed. In front of the silver wall, speed is useless. The eagle swordsman could not help but comfort himself. Brando's sword pointed at Devard's long and short swords. He took a step forward, and the 9 luminary sword art immediately created a phantom behind him. Brando's sword slashed down, and a silver mirror appeared in front of Devard like before. Dang! The long sword and the silver mirror shook violently together. In order to hide his identity, Brando did not use Haurangaya. However, his passive element was stability. Even if he used an ordinary longsword, it was still indestructible. Otherwise, the longsword in his hand would have turned into countless pieces of steel. Brando's attack was within Devard's expectations. A gold-rank swordsman would not be able to penetrate his silver wall. He sneered inwardly and raised his swords to stab at Brando. Unfortunately for Devard, the sword that was blocked by the silver wall did not even have time to retract it. Instead, another sword slashed down from the void. It was as if Brando's afterimage was in 2 different dimensions at the same time. The eagle swordsman could not believe his eyes. The sword hit the same spot on the silver wall again. Although the silver wall floated outside of Devard's body in a hemispherical shape, the elemental power was still the source of the elemental power. The vibrations caused by Brando's 2 swords were like slashes on Devard's body. Especially the second sword, he was caught off guard and was sent flying by the sudden huge force. Brando was unforgiving. Under the effect of charge, he flashed up and down in the courtyard 8 times. Each time, he left an afterimage of the 9 luminary sword art. It was as if 9 Brandos were attacking Devard at the same time, and each afterimage had a completely different attack path. Although Devard was a master swordsman, he had never seen an ancient swordsmanship like the 9 luminary sword art. This was a legendary swordsmanship that was as famous as Cruz's flash strike sword art. It was not something his eagle strike sword art could compete with. Not to mention, Brando had the upper hand from the beginning. He could not find a way to fight back at all. Devard was dumbfounded. He had more power than Brando, but he could not use it at all. 9 Brandos were surrounding him and attacking him. No matter how powerful an elemental awakener was, it was impossible to deal with 9 gold-ranked upper ranks at the same time. Not to mention, these 9 gold-ranked upper ranks were telepathically connected and worked closely together. There was no flaw to be found. At this moment, even Princess Magadal, who had no understanding of swordsmanship, could see that Brando's attack was too fast. She did not know that it was because of the 9 luminary sword art. She only knew that Brando's speed had exceeded the limit. She could not help but be stunned for a moment. How can there be such fast swordsmanship? Marquis Yoakum's eyes flashed. For a moment, he could not help but move his hand away from his wound. His face was covered in blood, but he did not feel it. But Brendel did not manage to break through the silver wall's defense after 9 consecutive strikes. Instead, he saw pieces of silver scales sticking out from the soil in the courtyard, and he immediately knew that something was wrong. He did not expect that the 9 luminary sword art would not be able to break through the defense of the silver wall. Instead, it made his opponent angry. Devard's active elemental power, the silver wave, was no joke. Once the great swordsman decided to use his active elemental power, this battle would likely become a bitter one. He had to end this quickly. Brando took a deep breath. The 9 figures merged into one. Although it seemed that he had the upper hand previously, his left hand was bleeding profusely. His right hand that was holding the sword was also cracked. The power of the elemental awakener was not to be underestimated. Just the recoil from Devard's parry was already too much for him to handle. However, he did not hesitate. His body stopped, and the long sword in his hand was already slashing towards Devard's wall of light. The eagle swordsman Devard was forced to this point by a junior who was 2 realms lower than him. At this moment he was extremely angry. He gritted his teeth and raised both his swords to block Brando's attack. The 3 swords clashed together. A large amount of sparks flew in the air. The golden sparks jumped and landed on the ground. With a crisp crack, the dagger in Devard's hand was broken. The eagle swordsman was shocked. Swordsmen of his level all used famous swords. This short sword was called Kai's Fong, and was a famous rune short sword. There were 3 layers of magic on it, but in the previous attack, all of the magic arrays had been destroyed, and even the magic metal on it had been broken into pieces. Brando's passive elemental power had a great advantage. However, he felt that his hand was about to break. He activated the piercing skill, and the wind from the tip of the blade pierced through Devard's back. The courtyard behind him was like a sieve being shot by a machine gun. A few pillars within 30 meters were all severed. Princess Magadal could not help but cover her mouth. How could she forget that this was the Anderla Cathedral? If these 2 were to go all out, wouldn't this place be torn apart? For a moment, the nun princess was frightened. Although she had a high status here, the old antiques in the Holy Temple could still scold her to death. Princess Magadal bit her lower lip. She had already decided to pay for the repairs with her own blood. She just hoped that these two would not make a big deal out of it. But her wish was destined to fail. Brando slashed down with the 9 luminary sword. This time, Brando activated the Ghost Knight's crystal's 30% strength and the piercing skill. With a loud bang, he and Devard retreated 7 steps. With a loud bang, half of the courtyard collapsed. This time Marquis Yoakum's face changed. He never dreamed that Brando would be so strong. If the two of them really tore down the Anderla Cathedral, he would have a hard time as well. At this time he finally reacted and made the most stupid decision in his life. Damn it, stop. But Brendel turned a deaf ear to his words. How could he stop now? He was still retreating, but the 9 luminary sword was still working as usual. He created another phantom and slashed at Devard. The Falcon swordsman was going crazy. He had no idea what Brando's strange swordsmanship was, but he saw with his own eyes that he and Brando were retreating. But in the next moment, Brando slashed at him again. What is he doing? Devard's heart was filled with grief and anger. It was as if the swordsmanship he had practiced for decades was a joke in the eyes of others. He finally could not help but explode. He did not even listen to Marquis Yoakum's orders. He roared, "Silver wave." Brando slashed down with his sword. At the same time, silver blades appeared in the air. There was no warning at all. Brando and his phantom were instantly cut open and blood flowed out. It was as if these blades appeared on his body in an instant. They did not even need to fly. This was the power of elemental strength. Active elemental strength was the biggest difference between elemental strength and those below the gold rank. The power of active elemental strength was unimaginable. Just like Mephisto's Grey Realm, it was not a power that could be reversed with ordinary skills. The silver wave was just like that. Its power was to damage all enemies that stepped into its range. There was no time to attack. Once damage was inflicted, it would automatically inflict damage, ignoring all defenses. Elemental strength was above the law. Nothing could stop it. Brando already knew this. He was covered in blood, but his expression did not change. His determination to attack was not shaken at all. Skills were activated in his vision one after another. The Fool's Talent Frenzy, the Ghost Knight's Crystal Pierce. The moment the inheritance of the Dark Dragon took effect, the whole temple shook. The Nun Princess's face was pale. This was elemental resonance, the true power of elemental activation. At this moment, Brando had already stepped into the realm of elemental strength. Although it was only for a moment, it was enough. His power directly penetrated the elemental wall and reached another level, even surpassing the elemental awakening stage. Even if the green sword Saint Veronica was here, Brando would only be slightly inferior. And Devard, who was in the situation, was so scared that he almost stopped breathing. He looked up and saw that there was only one sword left between heaven and earth. Brando's sword passed through the silver wall without any hindrance. It was not that the power was too strong, but that there was no resistance at all. Active elemental strength, spatial fault. A flash of blood, and Devard's screams resounded through the sky. Marquis Yoakum and Magadal watched as the famous master swordsman's right arm flew high into the sky. Brando had no intention of killing in the Holy Cathedral. If he really did so, things would be troublesome. But he had to teach him a lesson. He and Erek were destined to be enemies. Especially during this period of time in Ampere Seal, it was better to have one less enemy. He cut off Devard's right arm. He knew that with Erek's power and his relationship with the Holy Cathedral, it would not be difficult to heal this famous master swordsman. Limb regeneration was a very complicated spell, and the materials needed were astronomical for the average person. But for Grand Duke Erek, it was nothing. Even if he used magic to reattach the arm, he would not be able to use it for the time being. This meant that for the time being in Ampere Seal, the Grand Duke's right-hand man would be useless. Brando kept his sword, and the dissipating power immediately surged in all directions. The power of elemental awakening was terrifying, and the surrounding buildings immediately cracked and collapsed when it came into contact with them. Anderla Cathedral was about to face the biggest catastrophe since it was built, but at this moment, a majestic and solemn power descended from the sky, calming the violent power. The entire courtyard was suddenly enveloped in a sacred atmosphere. Brando turned his head with his face full of blood and saw Archbishop Wood walk out of the quiet room with a dark face. Damn, how could I forget that this guy is still here? Brando cursed in his heart. He was so impulsive that he only cared about crippling Devard that he forgot that the Archbishop of the Anderla Cathedral was still here. This was fun. He and Marquis Yoakum tore down a large part of the cathedral in front of him. This was a big joke. This, Lord Archbishop, as you can see, I didn't mean to. Brando immediately coughed and replied dryly. Wood looked at him unhappily, then looked at Marquis Yoakum. Ah, Lord Archbishop. Marquis Yoakum's eyes flashed when he saw Wood, but he still bowed gracefully. No more begging for next month's votes. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 538. The Holy Cathedral was in a mess and Marquis Yoakum, one of the main culprits, had already left. Brendel glanced at Archbishop Wood. Lord Archbishop, you shouldn't have come out. His previous joking attitude was replaced with a serious tone. If I didn't come out, wouldn't you have destroyed the entire temple? Do you know how long this temple has existed for? Archbishop Wood raised his eyebrows slightly and replied in an annoyed tone. Brando smiled awkwardly and turned to Princess Magadal. I haven't thanked you yet, Your Highness. May I know your name? Just call me Magadal. I'm just a nun here, sir. Magadal sighed. I'm sorry. I should have stopped the duel. Now I've caused so much trouble. This temple is Master Luo Nin's blood and sweat. We've profaned this piece of art. It's all my fault. No, Brando shook his head. Your Highness, you don't have to bear all the responsibility. Even if you had stopped me, I would still have insisted on dueling with him. The nun princess widened her brown eyes slightly and asked in surprise, why? Don't you regret it? If I can't protect my subordinates, then I will regret it. Brando replied seriously. Princess Magadal, this is why I'm grateful to you. This is the first time I've heard of such a thing. Normally, a vassal would be loyal to their superiors and protect their followers even at the cost of their lives. Isn't this their duty and obligation? Magadal blinked her eyes. A vassal swearing loyalty to the Lord, and as the follower, promises to give the follower glory and protection. This is a righteous contract. In ancient times, the ancestors of the wilderness made such a vow. Archbishop Wood looked at the monk soldiers who were cleaning up the mess in the courtyard and interrupted. But for this you have to pay 100,000 tor. Isn't that a little too expensive? Brando played with the new ring on his hand and shrugged. Anyway, it's not my money. Besides, that Marquis Yoakum paid more than me. He paid so much just to confirm whether or not the Archbishop was performing the ritual of a Templar Knight. That's really generous of him. If Marquis Yoakum were to hear this, he would be furious. Archbishop Wood did not reply. I see. Magadal looked at Brando carefully. Sir, may I know your name? Of course. My name is Sophie. Brendel could not help but look at Archbishop Wood when he answered. He was a little embarrassed to lie in front of someone who knew the truth, but the older, the wiser. Archbishop Wood's expression did not change, as if he did not hear anything. Sophie? The nun princess frowned and muttered. Why does it sound like a girl's name? Her voice was very soft, almost as if she was talking to herself. Unfortunately for her, Brendel was a gold-ranked existence, and his 5 senses were far more sensitive than ordinary people. He could not help but cough heavily when he heard her words. Fortunately, Magadal did not dwell on this question. She raised her head and asked, Mr. Sophie came to Ampere Seal to become a Templar Knight at this time of the year? Something like that. Brando suddenly thought of something and added, I also wanted to take a look at Ampere Seal to broaden my horizons. I have heard that this is the most prosperous port in the south of Wonde, but I have never seen it. Since I'm here, of course I want to see more. I see. Ampere Seal is indeed more prosperous than many places in Erewhon. But the most worthwhile place to visit in this city is probably the Anderla Cathedral. There is also the White Stone Lighthouse and the Rare Goods Market. The atmosphere of this city is indeed different from many other places. The nun princess nodded and replied. I heard that Ampere Seal has the largest auction in the south. In the history of Ampere Seal, there were even items that only existed in fantasy. Is that true? Brando pretended to question. In fact, no one knew more about Ampere Seal's auction than him. It was the auction with the highest number of players in Erewhon. It was held once a season, and many players would rush back from all over the world to participate in such a grand event. Ampere Seal's auction is indeed the most prestigious auction in Erewhon. Is Mr. Sophie interested in the auction? I am interested, but unfortunately, I do not have the qualifications to participate in the auction. Is Mr. Sophie troubled by this? Magadal asked with some surprise. That is not necessary. I happen to know the owner of the auction, Baron Donner. If Mr. Sophie does not mind, I can introduce you to him. The Baron is a serious businessman. I don't think he would be unwilling to have one more guest. Perfect. Brando knew that this well-connected princess must have her own way of doing things. However, he felt that he was taking advantage of her, so he apologized sincerely. If that is the case, it would be impolite of me to decline. I am very interested in seeing the auction. Thank you very much, Your Highness. It is nothing. Princess Magadol smiled at him as if she was very satisfied to be able to help others. However, Mr. Sophie, Marquis Yoakum is a narrow-minded person. Be careful that he does not take revenge on you and Ampere Seal. Of course I know. Brando nodded. Of course he knew this, but this time he came to Ampere Seal under an alias. Ampere Seal and the surrounding areas had a population of more than 300,000, and there were at least 1,000 nobles. As long as he left the Holy Cathedral, as long as Archbishop Wood did not say anything, Marquis Yoakum would not be able to find him. After Marquis Yoakum came out of the Anderla Cathedral, he immediately got into a carriage. Devard, who was seriously injured and pale, was also helped into the same carriage by his attendants. The smell of blood in the carriage was very strong. Those who knew Marquis Yoakum well knew that he was a very serious clean freak, but at this moment he did not even frown. He only said, "How are your injuries?" "Not too good, I'm afraid I will have to rest for half a year." Devard replied weakly. His wounds had been stopped bleeding with magic, but he was still too weak to sit properly. I did not expect that young man to be so strong. Marquis Yoakum could not help but touch his cheek. The cold pain made him grimace. He took a deep breath. No one had dared to hurt him since he was young. Marquis Yoakum fell silent, and for a moment no one knew what to think. "You were too impulsive this time, Marquis Yoakum." Devard replied weakly. That old man had only hosted the ceremony for these two people for more than 10 years. Of course I wanted to know what he was doing. He put his bloody finger to his nose and smelled it. He frowned and scolded. Impulsive, it's hard to say. But that bastard is too much. Isn't it just 2 women? How could he be so ruthless? I don't know where this bastard came from. Then what do you think, Marquis Yoakum? Magadol does not seem to know him, then he should not be on my lovely niece's side. Marquis Yoakum's face was gloomy. Probably a descendant of the ancient nobles. It is said that the late King Eric had the support of several hidden noble families. These nobles are more or less related to Cruz. But I don't know why that old man is looking for them at this time. Does he want to extend his term? My lord, this is to our plan. Devard suddenly struggled to sit up. Just stay here, what are you so nervous about? Marquis Yoakum changed his usual frivolous image and coldly glared at Devard. The dignified swordsman actually froze under his glare. Is it that easy for a magistrate to extend his term of office? Even the largest force in Kurlutz can't influence the decision of the Holy Cathedral. You have no brains at all. I think that old man wants to struggle, but let him be. It has nothing to do with us. Marquis Yoakum said as he lifted the curtain of the carriage and cast a cold glance outside, secretly grinding his teeth. Coming out of the Holy Cathedral, Amandina heard that Brando had a conflict with another marquis. She could not help but roll her eyes at him. But this was already good enough. Because Brando stood up for them, she did not take out her status as a lady to scold him. Brando was almost used to it. He was like a noble, but after all he was not one. This was really a case of kindness not being rewarded. Fortunately there was still Scarlet. This red-haired girl from the mountain village made Brando feel a little relieved. But he did not know what this girl was thinking. She was distracted all the way, and from time to time, she would raise her head and look at him with a strange expression. This made the noble lady beside her, who wanted to be on the same side, very speechless. The streets of Ampere Seal were extremely prosperous. This gray and white port was famous for its commerce. Legend had it that its streets were paved with jade and gold. Of course, this was an exaggeration, but this city could really mesmerize anyone who saw it for the first time. Brando did not want to go back for a while, so he brought the 2 beautiful girls on the streets to show off. As a man, it felt good to bring 2 beautiful girls shopping, especially when he did not have to carry things or stand outside the shop for half a day. Brando snickered as he opened the profession panel. On the profession panel there was a new profession, Templar Knight, with a total of 15 levels. Below it were 3 skills, Blood of the Sun, Conflicting Aura, and Crown of Thorns. There was nothing to study about them. He had sorted out the details of this profession very carefully in the game. Moreover, the main purpose of this profession was to obtain skills. The other useful skills of the Templar Knight could only be learned after level 30. Brando did not want to raise the level of this profession to that high for the time being. He opened the panel, glanced at it, and then began to upgrade the skills. First, he upgraded Conflicting Aura to level 10. Then he upgraded Blood of the Sun and Crown of Thorns to level 5. Because the Templar Knight was an advanced profession, the basic experience of its skills was calculated according to the level of an intermediate skill. So, this time he used a total of nearly 700,000 experience points. Fortunately, Brando had been continuously extracting the experience points from the fragments of Mavikart's tome. He now had more than 4 million experience points, and half of them were converted into skill experience points. The ball of light from the fragments of Mavikart's tome had shrunk by about a quarter. According to Brando's estimation, if all the experience points from the book were used to upgrade his profession level, it would directly raise his mercenary level to 50. But if it was just a profession level, it was meaningless. It would only increase his absolute strength. Devard the Eagle was a classic example. He could use the strength of an upper gold to suppress him. To put it bluntly, the Amber Sword's foundation was still the skills. When it came to skills, Brando looked at the 9 Luminaries' Art of the Wind and felt a little bitter. It required 250,000 experience points to upgrade from level 7 to level 8. Converted into skill experience points, it required 5 million experience points. Even if he dismantled all the fragments of Mavikart's tome, it would only be able to upgrade the skill to level 10. It was simply a bottomless pit. Brando let out a sigh of relief. The first thing he saw was Amandina's gloomy face. He didn't know why, but at this moment, he suddenly had the idea that a noble lady like her would be very suitable to wear glasses. Brando was a man of action, so he did what he said. Ampere Seal was full of shops selling all kinds of rare treasures. Brando easily bought her a pair of magic glasses from the Hazel people. Brando didn't do it on a whim. Amandina often had to work at her desk in the territory, and this pair of magic glasses was said to have the power to protect her vision. It was very suitable for this noble lady. Of course, only Brando knew whether it was out of concern for his subordinates or to satisfy his bad taste. Although Amandina didn't want to, it had to be said that the way she gritted her teeth while wearing the glasses was different. She looked like a serious bespectacled lady. The three of them strolled around until the sun was setting. When the main commercial streets of Ampere Seal were dyed a bronze red, they returned to the inn with a large pile of gifts. When they returned to the inn, it was almost time for dinner. However, Brando found that a few of his main subordinates had been waiting for him for a long time. After asking, he found out that Sue, who had returned from outside, brought back new news. P.S. I saw 2 questions in the comments section. One is about the elite template. The elite template requires the level of a single profession, not the total level. Secondly, the strength crystal gives a 10% increase. With a shake of my hand, I wrote 30. I'm kneeling. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 539. In this world, there was no such thing as an impenetrable wall. In just 3 days, the news of the duel at the Anderla Cathedral had spread among the nobles, and then to the commoners. One side of the duel was the famous sword hero Erek, but he lost to a young man of unknown origin. Until the bards adapted this experience into a story, Brando had become the most outstanding person of Erwin's younger generation. At least in Ampere Seal, his fame was almost on par with Erwin's younger generation of nobles. Almost everyone was guessing who he was, but only a few people knew that Captain Wood had personally presided over the ceremony for him. This person must have an extraordinary background. For a time, all the forces in Ampere Seal, big and small, were moved. Even the future Princess Regent sent people to investigate Brando's background. Especially after her close friend, Magadol, found out the truth of the matter. Erek and House Cypher were no exception. The roads of Ampere Seal were suddenly filled with people from all walks of life, causing chaos. Fortunately, the ordinary citizens had long gotten used to the way the nobles would tense up at the slightest sign of trouble. The people who lived in such a tense atmosphere comforted themselves by saying that as long as the port of Ampere Seal was still filled with white sails and the Anderla Cathedral still existed, the port would not decline. The bell of the Holy Temple was a commentary to this phrase, and day after day it continued to ring throughout the grey and white harbor city, unmoved. In the midst of the panic, Brando himself spent every day in Ampere Seal in an orderly manner. As he expected, as long as the Archbishop of the Anderla Cathedral did not say anything, no one would find him. Over the past week, he had met the owner of the auction, Count Donner, under the introduction of Magadol. The latter was very interested in the painting of Princess Anyao that he wanted to sell. However, Brando, or rather, the merchant lady, smiled politely and did not show him the painting in his hand. Instead, he tactfully said that he would send the painting over in a few days for Count Donner to verify its authenticity. Brendel found it hilarious to watch the Baron's itchy face and Romaine's slow and unhurried conversation. But in the end, even this experienced businessman could not help but sigh at his inferiority, praising that Romaine was born to be a businesswoman. This was somewhat out of Brando's expectations. He knew that the Roman lady was talented in business, but her brain was not very clear. Or it could be said that her logic circuit was different from ordinary people. Plus, she did not have many opportunities to deal with people in the same field. In other words, she lacked experience. After all, talking on paper was different from actually doing it. This was even more so when dealing with people. To be honest, before he brought her here, he was wondering if this little cutie would have stage fright. How was it, Brando? When they walked out of Baron Donner's mansion, the little Roman raised her head proudly and stared at him. Her slender neck supported her beautiful head. Her dark brown hair was tied up, and she wore the black dress that Brando bought for her at Bragg's. Under the curve of her neck, her collarbone shone like snow. She wore a ruby necklace that shone like fire and blood. The necklace shone brightly, and in a trance, it set off the merchant lady's confidence and pride. Brando could completely understand her pride. Because she was the person he loved, she was proud. This faint smile with her aura made Brando's heart palpitate. Yes. Brando nodded subconsciously. Little Roman, you did better than I expected. I just didn't expect that old gentleman to praise you so much. Even in this city, he is considered a person with a reputation. Brando suddenly realized that the little Roman's opponent was not simple. Donner's life was also the story of another genius. That man was the first person in Amberlight who relied on his identity as a merchant to obtain the honor of being a noble. The old man is too kind. The Roman raised her willowy eyebrows and answered matter-of-factly. Brendel turned back to look at her. It was rare to see the merchant lady being so humble. Even when she was still in Bucci, this young lady's heart was higher than the sky. She would never show her hesitant side in front of anyone, as if she was born to be the master of the scene. If there is desire, there will be a weakness. The little Roman replied in an unfathomable tone, but the second half of the sentence was leaked. Aunt said that if someone uses Brando and the little Roman to make a deal, the Roman will also feel distressed. The first half of the sentence sounded reasonable, but the more Brendel heard, the more ridiculous it became. He pinched the little boy's cheeks and said, "Don't talk about using your fiancé to make a deal with me in such a serious manner." Ouch, 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 Brando, you, ouch. Let go. The merchant lady immediately raised her eyebrows, and her little face was twisted by Brando. Beside them, nun Princess Magadol looked at the man and woman with a strange expression. She did not know why, but she felt a little envious. After a long while, she squeezed out a suitable sentence. "The two of you have such a good relationship." Brando smiled and let go of the little Roman. He raised his head and looked at the bright silver moon above Amberlight. In the next few days, the news of the war in the north finally spread. The Kurlutz people had already marched their cavalry into the sword fortress, and the threat of the lion beastmen seemed to have become a reality overnight. The holy war quickly replaced the young swordsman as the hottest topic among the people of Amberlight. Even the air seemed to be brewing with a heavy sense of conspiracy. The Anderlecht Cathedral was about to change, and the cathedral became busy. On the other hand, ever since he saw Devard the Eagle by Marquis Joachim's side, Brando smelled a hint of hidden danger. He asked Sue and Andrique's subordinates to gather information. Vampires were creatures that lived in the shadows, and spying was one of their best jobs. Madara had sent vampires to infiltrate humans several times to gather information, and Brando was just following suit. However, the news that Mephistopheles and Andrique found out only increased his suspicions. It was said that Erek was now staying in a castle in the south of Amberlight, and the castle was heavily guarded. Brando knew Erek's temperament very well. He was a cunning old fox, and if he was so cautious, he must be brewing some kind of conspiracy. It was a pity that the female vampire had tested the castle's defenses and could not do anything. This news made Brando feel a sense of urgency. He wanted to see Princess Griffin and warn her in advance, but it was a pity that the princess's manor was also heavily guarded. Otherwise, he would have wanted to sneak in at least once. The time for the meeting of the nobles was getting closer and closer, and in the end, Brando had to give up his suspicions about Erek. On the other hand, Archbishop Brando would send his confidants to inform him every day about the movements of the nobles in the Holy Cathedral. Of course, this information seemed to be floating on the surface, and as long as Brando moved his hands he could find out. However, Archbishop Wood's actions saved him a lot of time, and on the other hand he could rest assured about the movements of the Holy Cathedral. In comparison, Archbishop Wood was still presiding over the daily affairs of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the Anderla Cathedral, and this message alone conveyed enough information. After settling down, Brando had to face the problem of how to sneak into the meeting of the nobles. This was the biggest problem he had to solve. He would not ask Archbishop Wood for help. After all, this was a matter of great importance and could easily be used against him. Not to mention that the Archbishop would definitely not agree. Brando himself was not willing to cause trouble for the Holy Cathedral of Fire for the time being. He thought about it, and only the news that Sue brought back a week ago was more reliable. Of course, it was actually not reliable news. In the middle of the month of recovery, 2 days before the meeting of the nobles, Ampere Seal faced the sea to the west, and the Shakrod Strait divided the narrow peninsula. The salty sea water carved a white trail under the cliffs, constantly beating the dark brown rocks. Geographically, Ampere Seal was located at the end of the northern branch of the Ancely Mountains, Erect Mountains, where the mountains met the sea. This was where the sea breeze and the sea current converged. The climate was humid and clouds gathered at the foothills. The result of the abundant rainfall was a forest cover. To the east of the port city, there were large forests, dense with black pine and erect hazel. The silver fairy princess Medisha was hiding in the bushes, her silver-gray battle robe covered with the wet dew of the night. She could not help but cough twice. Her gaze passed through the forest on the mountainside, and in the darkness not far away, there was a small town that was brightly lit. There were a few manors in the small town, and this place was more than 10 miles away from Ampere Seal. This town could be said to be dependent on the port city. There were many towns like this near Ampere Seal. Is it here, Sue? She used her knuckles to tap the map on the tree stump and turned back to ask. Sue's eyes sparkled under the light, but there was no expression in them. It was as if answering this question was as boring as reciting a book, but she still completed it meticulously. Her gaze also fell on the foot of the mountain. She had ordered her subordinates to confirm this town many times over the past few days, and there was no mistake. The Silver Fairy Princess was born to not doubt her companions. After hearing this answer, she turned back to the dark forest and whispered, "My lord." A gritting sound came from the bushes. "Wait, hiss, F***CKBLZ's little tyrant server." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 540. The girl's soft lips were like a feather, gently imprinting on his neck, making Brando shudder. Her sharp teeth rubbed against his skin, penetrating his skin and piercing into his arteries. Andrique was like a soft and boneless cat lying on top of Brando's body, carefully tasting the taste of his blood and letting out a satisfied nasal sound. After sucking his blood, the princess-like vampire licked his neck as if she hadn't had enough, making Brando shudder in pain. Brando sucked in a breath of cold air. Normally, vampires would release an emotional factor to their host when they were sucking blood, causing the host to fall into an illusory state of happiness. Generally speaking, being sucked blood was a painful and joyful thing. However, Andrique never bothered to do so. According to her, it was something that only shameless people would do. Every time this happened, a certain trap would be shot and fall to the ground. In short, being sucked blood by Andrique was a very painful thing. The only consolation was that every time the girl sucked blood, she would snuggle into Brando's arms like a lover, exuding a seductive charm. Andrique was definitely a femme fatale. Her well-proportioned and boneless body was completely pressed against Brando's chest, and Brando could almost feel 2 soft lumps touching his skin. The girl's curvaceous thighs stretched out from under the ruffles of her black dress, as white as jade under the moonlight in the wilderness. It really made one's imagination run wild. "I'm done," Andrique said to the Mephistopheles as if she was the host. The vampire replied with an "oh." The blood descendants were like a hierarchical society. After the noble girl finished drinking her host's blood, the Mephistopheles kissed Brando's neck from both sides. "Hey hey." Brando was held down by the 2 gold-ranked vampires and couldn't move. "You said you wouldn't bite my neck. Even my big sister can bite it, why can't I?" "There's a difference between men and women." Mephistopheles playfully fluttered her long eyelashes and pretended not to hear him. She tucked her hair behind her ear with one hand and bent down to take a bite. Brando rubbed his neck and looked at Medisha apologetically. The Silver Fairy Princess smiled gently at him. "My lord, now that you've found out that you're with us undead, you'll encounter all kinds of trouble, right? Because they are not living creatures, they have to rely on something to entrust themselves to this world. This is the law of the dead." Only then did Brando remember that the little princess was also a ghost. However, she was probably the most beautiful ghost in the world. The Silver Fairy Princess's long silver hair and armor glowed faintly. This was actually a special characteristic of a spirit body. Brando shifted his gaze away from her and looked towards the small town at the foot of the mountain. "How is it?" The small town at the foot of the mountain was silent in the darkness. There was only a hazy light in the distance. Only the elves could see so far and so clearly. Of course, the merchant lady could as well. "It's here," Sue answered. Sue said that it's here. Lord Nightsong had also led the other mercenaries of Lopez to investigate. The townspeople said that there was indeed a foreign noble living here for the past few weeks, but they're not sure if it's Count Yenbao. Medisha replied. Brando listened and nodded. This was the answer that Sue had given him, to replace the Count's envoy and attend the meeting of the nobles. Kidnapping the envoy of the Count, or even the Count himself, sounded ridiculous, but it coincided with Brando's thoughts. The meeting of the nobles would be held in 2 days at the Sephora Manor, which was the property of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The Holy Cathedral of Fire would arrange their own personnel to maintain the venue, so it was impossible for outsiders to sneak in. Of course, Brando would not be stupid enough to ask for Captain Wood's help in this matter, mainly because it would be too easy to leave evidence behind. Besides, with the position of the Archbishop, he would definitely not agree. The only way was to pretend to be a noble. Now it was known that 5 of the 6 Grand Dukes were participating in this meeting. Among them, Grand Duke Vero and Grand Duke Karsuk had sent their own envoys. Grand Duke Cypher and Grand Duke Arek had gone personally. Corvado was the fief of the royal family, so the envoys of the eldest prince would naturally go as well. Only Grand Duke Grenoires maintained his usual indifferent attitude and did not even have the mood to send an envoy. Of course, as long as Brando's brain was still working, he would not want to pretend to be these people. For the same reason, the 2 marquises and Prince Lu Ku were the same, leaving only the 5 special counts of Erewhon. Count Randner was naturally impossible. Count Vitokin was also ruled out as the commander of the Black Blade Squad, and Count Janalesu was the commander of the Royal Fleet, so he could not choose either. Therefore, Brando could only pretend to be 2 people left. One was Count Cordo of Grey Mountain, and the other was Count Yenbao. However, Count Grey Mountain's territory was next to Corvado, so he must be familiar with it. In contrast, Yenbao was located at the northern border of the kingdom and was the weakest special count. Its count rarely dealt with the other nobles of the kingdom. It could be said that he lived in seclusion. Even Brando, a player who usually ran around, had never seen this count, and even fewer people in the noble circle of the kingdom were familiar with him. With such a comparison, the answer was clear. It doesn't matter if it is or not, let's take a look first. Kidnapping a noble's envoy sounded simple, but Count Yenbao was still a special count. How could he not be heavily guarded? However, Brando believed in the strength of his subordinates, so he decided to take a look first. Count Yenbao's manor was located in a secluded forest near the town. This count did not have any reliable friends in Ampere Seal, so the manor was rented temporarily. Ampere Seal often had merchants and nobles from all over the kingdom, so there were many manors like this in the vicinity. Before coming here, Sue had already sent people to inquire about this manor. This manor was the property of a merchant who did not have any background. This news also made Brando feel more at ease about the whole plan. The group quietly snuck into the Erek Hazel forest less than 100 meters away from the manor. The bushes here were dense, and at this distance, they did not have to worry about being discovered by the manor's guards. However, even so, Brando still ordered Medisha to stay further away. The fairy princess's slightly glowing silver armor was really suitable for stealth operations. He simply let her and Scarlet lead the Fireclaw lizard men to set up a suitable distance. If there were any accidents, at least they could provide support. No matter what, their next move could be said to be a little crazy, and Brando had to be careful. Beside Brando were the mercenaries of Lopez, the 2 cute Miss Vampires, and Andrique's black derivatives, the Blood Descendants. These Blood Descendants were all young boys and girls, and their strength was between the peak of iron and the beginning of silver. However, they were exceptionally good at stealth operations, and were not inferior to the experienced mercenaries from the 10 cities. In addition, there was also an extremely untimely presence. Miss Merchant had quietly followed Brando without anyone's permission. When she walked, she was like a little kitten. If she had not been sneakily following behind Brando, even Brando himself would not have noticed this little fellow. It had to be said that this was an incredible stealth talent, especially when she had not been specially trained. Even the best fighter in the mercenaries of Lopez, Nightingale, could not help but praise her. However, from Brando's point of view, it was more like this young lady was born with these skills that could be used to do bad things. In short, the word virtuous did not apply to Miss Merchant. However, Brando had also thought it through. Instead of letting this little thing play tricks in places where he could not notice, it was better to keep her by his side. At least he could monitor her and prevent her from causing any trouble. Therefore, after strictly ordering the Roman to stay within 5 feet of him, he decided to let this young lady do as she pleased. It seemed that the little Roman was quite satisfied with Brando's order. In fact, she just wanted to go on an adventure with him. After settling this little interlude, Brando released a few wind spirit spiders. The wind spirit spiders could not share his senses, so their use in scouting the terrain was minimal. However, they were extremely useful in monitoring the surroundings. Then he raised his head and looked in the direction of the manor and asked, "How many guards are there? I can clearly see one at the main entrance, but I don't know if there are any hidden sentries, my lord." In the dark, a vampire's vision was much better than a human's, so one of the vampires immediately answered. Brando was quite satisfied with this answer. Behind the layers of trees, it was difficult to clearly see the manor from 100 meters away. He nodded and used the wind spirit spiders to sense if there were any hidden sentries. He was about to order everyone to approach the manor when the Roman suddenly said, "The Roman saw that there were still people in the manor. I saw someone by the fountain in the courtyard. Oh, he seemed to have kicked something." He bent down to pick up the stone and threw it into the fountain. Everyone looked at the merchant lady in shock. Brando then remembered that there was a human-shaped self-driving radar beside him. He suddenly felt that it was a great idea for the merchant lady to follow him. He quickly asked, "Did you see any hidden sentries?" "Hidden sentries? He's the one who hid." "Oh, there are 2 of them. Where are they?" The Nightsong Tiger raised his eyebrows and immediately asked. "They're behind the guard at the entrance." The Nightsong Tiger immediately turned to Brando and said, "They're very experienced and we don't know how many people are in the courtyard. This is going to be troublesome, my lord." As an experienced mercenary, the captain of the mercenaries of Lopez was very sensitive to the location of the sentries. He could often make a rough guess based on the clues. Brando had always trusted his judgment, so he nodded and muttered, "Do you have any ideas?" "Find a way to catch a tongue," the Nightsong Tiger replied. Brando nodded again, then Mephistopheles, "Follow me." With that, a layer of dense black smoke suddenly appeared on his clothes. This layer of black smoke quickly enveloped the conspicuous red blessings and Hauran Gaia. Brando did not want to expose his identity, so the best choice was to disguise himself as a member of the Dark Church. He pulled up the hood of his cloak and was about to leave, but at this moment, the Roman suddenly took out a small and exquisite silver cage and said with a proud expression, "Brando, do you want to catch someone? Roman will help you." Before Brando could react, the Roman clapped her hands and chanted, the person in the cage who took away your freedom?" She clapped her hands and a white light flashed in the cage, and a small person appeared in the empty silver cage. Brando and the others were not surprised. Andrique, Mephistopheles, and the other vampires looked at the merchant lady in shock. "What is this?" Brando immediately stopped and looked at the terrified little person in the cage. "My lord," the vampire who spoke before had a strange expression. This is the guard at the entrance." Dark witchcraft. Brando was stunned. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 541. The guard in the cage was scared out of his wits. He thought that he was captured by the evil wizards who came out of nowhere. He trembled in fear, and when Brendel and the others interrogated him, he spat out everything that happened in the manor. There were more than 30 guards in the manor. Including the cook and the servants, there were nearly 100 people. He wasn't sure if the count had come in person because the 3 knights were usually in charge of delivering orders. According to the guard's description, Brando guessed that the strength of the 3 knights should be in the gold realm. He frowned slightly. With his current strength, dealing with 3 gold realms shouldn't be a problem. However, he didn't know what skills the enemy was good at. It wouldn't be easy to not make a scene. However, he was more concerned about where Roman's inexplicable black witchcraft came from. Little Roman's eyes rolled around, saying that her big sister taught her. As for who her big sister was, no one could say for sure. She held the cage and explained how the spell worked. The cage could imprison any creature in the witch's sight. As long as the former's will was not strong enough, they would be trapped by the spell. The target of the spell was not limited to one person but up to 10 people. Brando listened for a while and understood that this was a reality illusion. As long as the target believed in it, the illusion would become reality. However, whether the target believed in it or not, it had to go through the subconscious first. However, this spell was not omnipotent. With the level of this spell, it was more than enough to imprison a guard in the upper level of the Iron Realm. However, it was not so sure if it was used against stronger enemies. Bewitching people and tempting the dark side of people was a classic black witchcraft. The little Roman covered the cage with a black cloth. This way the person in the cage could not sense anything from the outside world. Everyone was amazed by the witch's magical spells, and even Charles couldn't help but compliment them. As law wizards, their spells were magical in the eyes of ordinary people, such as building a bridge out of thin air, turning into a wall, and even melting steel at high temperatures. However, the law wizards manipulated the lines of law in the world of Vaunt, and ultimately they couldn't break away from their own laws. They couldn't turn flames cold and they couldn't turn ice hot, but witches were the exact opposite. Witches' spells were magical, and they could do many things that went against common sense. Therefore, the world did not like witches because their magic was more inclined towards chaos. Some people even threatened that witches had an affair with Dusk. Of course, Brando knew that this was just nonsense. In any case, dark witchcraft wasn't considered honorable in terms of its power. He pondered for a moment. It seems that I have to find Aunt Jenny quickly to figure out what happened to you. It's a pity that I haven't heard from her. But then again, aren't you worried about my aunt at all? Romaine's eyes widened and her flat forehead glistened. My aunt often goes out and only comes back home after a few months. It's been almost a year. Brando couldn't help but facepalm. Alright, before we figure out the whole story, you're forbidden from using these strange spells in front of others. Do you understand? What? My little Roman doesn't want to be tied to a stake and burned, right? Brando replied seriously. The Roman thought about it seriously and nodded. He also felt that this wasn't a good idea, so he agreed. Okay, Brando. Most of the people were used to the way the two talked, so they silently waited for Brando to make a decision. Brando looked in the direction of the manor and called the guard in the cage to ask about the general distribution of the guards in the manor. Because the Roman had covered the silver cage with a black cloth, the guard didn't hear anything before. Now that he was called out to ask again, he still looked frightened. Brando listened carefully to the guard's description and asked without any change in his expression, "Are there people patrolling?" The guard nodded like a chicken pecking at rice and stammered, "Yes. Yes. Master Wizard." Brando quickly understood that there was a group of cavalry patrolling the manor, and they would pass by about once every half an hour. This was the information he needed to know. He then tapped the cage and put down the black cloth again. He asked the Roman, "Since you can catch him, you can let him go, right?" The little Roman nodded quickly, as if she was afraid that Brando would think that she wasn't strong enough. That was more than enough. Brando continued with a series of threats and promises, trying to intimidate the guard into not revealing anything about their encounter. You know, it is very easy for a mysterious wizard to frighten a normal person. Therefore, everyone knows that they have all kinds of methods to kill people, and even make them suffer a fate worse than death. One of the most famous methods is to cast a curse. Brando pretended to cast a curse on the guard that if he didn't listen, his body would fester and he would die. Then he asked the little Roman to let him go. Brando didn't want to attract the attention of the hidden sentries in the manor. Although this black magic could create a reasonable illusion in everyone's mind for a short period of time, some people had higher willpower, and once they broke free they would realize that something was wrong. Moreover, the guard was already frightened to the point of having a mental breakdown. Brando let him go, and he obediently stood at his post, afraid that the wizard would not be satisfied with him and directly turn him into a pool of pus. The next thing was simple. Brando waited for the patrolling riders to appear, and immediately asked the little Roman to use the same black magic to capture all of them. After that, he released them one by one and asked the vampire to knock them out with a karate chop. There were a total of 6 patrolling riders. Brando selected Mephistopheles, Andrique, the Nightsong Tiger, the Shire, and the wild elf sister Falerne from his subordinates and had them change into the knight's battle robes. The others did not have any objections to Brando's selection. Mephistopheles, Andrique, the Nightsong Tiger, and the Shire were either outstanding or experienced. However, Falerne was a little too conspicuous. God knows why Brando left the last spot for Falerne. It was purely out of habit that he wanted to bring along a lucky girl. Naturally, the others could not figure out the reason behind it. They could only look at the two of them with a slightly ambiguous gaze. Falerne thought about it and could not help but look at Brando suspiciously. However, she did not say anything and only nodded. Brando did not realize that his random decision made the others think that he had an affair with his personal secretary. Even if he did, he would not know whether to laugh or cry. This was just a small interlude. Brendel had already asked the patrolling cavalry's route, and now he led the others out of the forest as if nothing had happened. He rode on the cavalry's war horses and continued to advance along the manor. Brando looked around the manor. Although most of the manors around Amberlight had a certain degree of defensive capabilities, these private manors were not fortresses. Moreover, the security around Amberlight was not bad. Therefore, the outer walls of the manor were at most used to guard against ordinary thieves. The outer walls of the manor were only about 2 to 3 meters high. In the eyes of those with some strength, it was not much different from nothing. Inside was the courtyard, and the main building was at the southern end behind layers of treetops. The 6 of them circled around the manor, and then approached the back door of the manor according to the predetermined route. The back door of the manor was between 2 tall pine trees. However, at this time, the Shire came close to Brando and whispered, "There's a warning spell." Brando thought to himself. The Shire, who was not good at moving around in armor, joined the team for this reason. They were now covered by Andrique's disguise spell, but there were many truth-type spells in the Amber Sword that could see through their disguise. However, as a law-defying wizard, Seal was the type of person who was best at dealing with spells and dissolving spells. Brando did not believe that Count Yenbao had wizards who were better than the Shire. He knew that in the whole of Erewhon, the Shire was probably second only to Fleetwood and Tulman. Even if the Black Tower wizards in Karsuk were included, the Shire could still be ranked in the top 5. "Can you deal with it?" But he still tilted his head and asked. The Shire nodded. "The opponent's spellcaster seems to be only a mid-silver. I'm sure I can deal with this spell without leaving any traces, my lord." "Don't remove it, it's too conspicuous." Brando looked forward and replied. "Of course I understand." That was enough. The group slowly approached the back door. The Shire moved his fingers slightly, and an almost imperceptible light blue light pierced into the manor. Over the entire manor, the hexagonal grid of light flashed imperceptibly, and then quickly dimmed. All of this happened so fast that it was impossible for ordinary people to see it with their naked eyes. As for the wizards who judged the existence of spells in the surrounding space based on the magical fluctuations, the Shire had already suppressed the fluctuations to the minimum. Naturally, the wizards in the manor could not detect what happened in a short period of time. After retracting his hand, the Shire immediately told the others through telepathy that the spell net around the door and the surrounding area had been temporarily suppressed for 10 minutes. This was more than enough for Brando. The group quietly passed through the back door. There were 3 guards at the back door. However, in the eyes of these guards, there was nothing unusual about the patrolling knights. They were still the same old faces that they were familiar with. Brendel even greeted one of the guards. He had done this sort of thing more than once in the game and was very experienced. He had already asked for the details beforehand, including the secret signal and the characteristics of the guards. He did not miss out on any of them. After passing through the back door, they entered the courtyard of the manor. However, Brando knew that they could not act rashly for now. They slowly walked along the small path in the manor, and their first destination was the stable. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 542. Byrne had worked in the Hoarfrost Manor for 16 years, and he knew that he was a guard hired by the owner of the manor. Most of the nobles who lived in the manor would not trust an outsider like him, so he was satisfied with his job of guarding the stables. He did not have many goals and he only wanted to earn a living. Fortunately, this was not a high demand in the vicinity of Amberlight. When he was free, he could even drink a few cups of liquor that was specially brewed in the plantation at the foot of the Enseli Mountains. After all, the horses of the nobles were taken care of by someone else, so it was not his place to interfere. Byrne's job was literally to guard the stables, but only the stables. After all, the stables were the private property of the big merchant who owned the land. Soon he saw the nobleman who lived here today. He heard that it was the Count's knight who came back from the courtyard. Byrne quickly wiped his mouth and put away the leather pouch filled with liquor. He did not dare to drink too much as he did not want to lose his job because his breath reeked of alcohol. Although it was easy to find a job near Amberlight, it was rare to find a job that was so easy and so well paid. He did not dare to look up at the high and mighty knight, so he quickly lowered his head and put on a respectful look. As usual, the knights acted as if they didn't see him and walked past him into the stable. Byrne was already cursing them in his mind. These bastard knights. It was as if he had learned all these dirty words since he was in his mother's womb. However, at this moment, Byrne heard a cold snort from a woman. He was slightly startled, and as a guard for more than 10 years, he immediately realized that something was wrong. But before he could react, a cold blade was placed against his neck. Byrne was so scared that his heart stopped beating. He thought to himself that he was done for. His body was drenched in cold sweat. He trembled as he turned around only to see a beautiful face. Byrne subconsciously thought that if there was a princess, then this young lady in front of him must be the princess. Who allowed you to turn your head? Andrique's face was sour as if someone owed her tens of millions of tor. The young lady's temper was not good, Byrne thought with trepidation. However, Brando quickly stopped the vampire maiden from fooling the poor, honest man. He couldn't help but think that these vampires were really boring. They knew that the manor's guards were unreliable, so there was no point in scaring them. Andrique glanced at him expressionlessly, then crooked her finger at the human guard in front of her. The guard's eyes immediately became confused. As a matter of fact, most of the spellcasters among the vampires were experts in bewitching others. Andrea was no exception. She was an expert in curse-type spells, but she also had some knowledge in bewitching spells. Controlling a guard who was not even iron rank was a piece of cake for her. However, this action only intensified Brando's suspicions. She could have easily solved the problem with a spell, but she insisted on teasing her prey like a cat toying with a mouse. He originally thought that Andrique was a cold-hearted girl, but he did not expect her to be as boring as other vampires. On the other hand, Mephistopheles did not have such bad habits. Other than their sexual orientation, they were not like vampires at all. They were so innocent that they were cute. Although they were indeed cute. The young lord sighed. Tell him to knock on the manor's door and say, Andrique said that the lords? Beanold's warhorse seems to have some problems. Tell them to hurry over and take a look. Brendel turned around to look at the stable and immediately recognized the most expensive warhorse. He cursed in his heart for being a tycoon, but at the same time, he ordered Andrea without any change in his expression. The Beanold warhorse was produced in the Surin Plateau between Cruz and Grecius. It was thousands of miles away from Erewhon. A pure Beanold warhorse was worth tens of thousands of gold coins in the Ten-City Alliance, which was the closest to the Night Kingdom of Grecius, let alone in Erewhon. However, it was common practice for nobles to love horses. Brando was not too surprised to see the most expensive Beanold warhorse in the noble's stable. The Andrique he mentioned was one of the patrolling guards. He should have been tied up and thrown into the forest outside. Andrique snorted softly and lowered her head arrogantly. Did you hear that? Byrne was charmed by her and did not dare to resist. He nodded stiffly. Seeing this, Brando could not help but feel a little curious. Will he be seen through with his blank expression? In fact, the spells used to confuse the mind in the Amber Sword were all dark witchcraft. Even for the young lord who had seen many things, this was the first time he had seen such spells in detail. He's only acting this way because he's in awe of the master. Of course he'll act normal in front of others. Andrique gave him a "you're just a country bumpkin" attitude. Brando was always curious about the unknown things in the Amber Sword, just like a player like himself. Therefore he did not mind Andrique's attitude. He thought for a moment and said, wouldn't that be too scary? Wouldn't it be impossible to tell? It's not that simple. This kind of trick is useless in front of wizards. A low-level apprentice can see through it. However, an apprentice needs to cast a spell to be able to tell if it's real or fake. A slightly higher-level wizard can see through it at a glance. Also, those who are familiar with him can also see some clues. After all, he's being manipulated by magic. His movements are always a little unnatural. The vampire girl's answer was very detailed. Besides, this is just a little trick. It's just a side branch of dark witchcraft. I'm just interested in it, that's why I'm studying it. A little trick. Because it's too weak. Those who are above silver rank can resist the effects of magic with their will alone. The effect of mind confusion on them is next to nothing. Brando then understood. At this time, the guard had already turned around and walked towards the manor. In fact, the manor was not far from the stables. It was only about 100 steps away. Within this distance, those who were above gold rank could easily sense the movements around them. Brando could even hear the guard stopping and knocking on the door. It should be the back door of the manor's kitchen. The guard knocked for a while before the door opened with a creak. In fact, Byrne knocked 3 times before the door opened a little. A pair of impatient eyes looked at him from behind the door. "What do you want?" Byrne knew this knight. He was one of the many servants of the noble lord. However, that was all he knew. He only saw the knight from behind the noble lord during the day. When he saw the knight, he quickly lowered his head and answered, "Andrek said that there's something wrong with the lord's Beanold's warhorse. He asked them to hurry over and take a look." Byrne's imitation of Brendel's tone was perfect, at least 80 to 90% of it. He was able to imitate Brendel's demeanor and tone perfectly. When Brando heard this, he almost spat out the water in his mouth. He turned around and looked at Andrique. The vampire girl could not help but cover her face. "That idiot." Andrique squeezed the words out from between her teeth. Her snow-white skin could not help but blush. In fact, the vampire girl felt that she was being humiliated by this stupid servant. She hurriedly hooked her finger and said a strange word, "Turios." "What does that mean?" "Nothing. It just makes people more willing to believe that the lies they hear are reasonable." Andrique snorted softly. "This is also what you call black witchcraft. But the effect is minimal. I can only do my best." Brando turned around. Mephistopheles, the night-song tiger, and Falerne subconsciously put their hands on their weapons. The Shire also silently put his hand on his spellbook. Everyone looked at the door nervously. The knight behind the door was stunned. He did not realize that something was wrong. Instead he cursed, "What? What the hell is that fellow Undercock up to? Did he kill the Count's horse? Is he so scared that he can't even speak properly?" That being said, everyone in the manor knew that the Beanold horse was the Count's treasure. The knight had no choice but to be cautious. He opened the door and looked around. Then he said to Bourne fiercely, "Don't tell anyone for now. Wait for me to come back." Byrne nodded his head obediently. The knight didn't seem to realize that something was wrong. He didn't even bring his weapon as he hurried over. But as soon as he entered the stable, before he could speak, he saw a cold sword pointed at his throat. What? The knight was stunned. Then he saw Brando and the others and his expression changed. He wanted to say something, but Brando pushed the sword forward. The pain immediately shut him up. "Who are you?" The knight seemed to have finally understood his position. He could not help but ask, "Where is Andrek? Do you know who you are offending?" "Don't ask nonsense." Brando did not have time to waste on this guy. He turned his head and signaled the Mephistopheles to restrain the guy. Then he said, "You only have 2 choices. First, bring us into the manor. I don't need to tell you the second choice, right?" The knight understood Brando's meaning. His face turned from white to red and then from red to white. He hesitated for a moment, but he did not hesitate. He said, "I can't just bring you in like this. I need an excuse. I don't want to die with you. Otherwise I'll die anyway. Why don't you just kill me now?" "You're still clear-headed." Brando could not help but praise him. "The excuse is simple. Didn't I tell you just now?" "Just now." The knight blinked. Only then did he remember what Byrne told him. His expression changed again and he nodded. "All right, you have to promise not to kill me." Brando immediately swore to Martha. He did not intend to kill anyone. The best outcome was to subdue the Count. If there was blood, it would not be easy to clean up the mess in the future. After all, openly attacking a noble was strictly forbidden in the code of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Brando knew very well that he was just skirting the line. Because of this reason, in fact, he only told his summoned creatures, Amandina, and a few of his core subordinates. He did not even tell the truth to the young officers of the White Lion Legion. Brando could not guarantee that everyone would be willing to do this with him. As for Amandina, Scarlet and the others, they had already experienced the real test of life and death with him. Naturally, they were different. When the knight saw Brendel's oath, he was 90% convinced. In the Amber Sword, the people of the civilized world swearing to Martha was a very solemn thing, and no one dared to go against it. After all, the consequences of going against an oath were obvious. This was a world with real gods, and Martha who walked in the sky would not allow the people of the world to use her name to swindle and deceive. After acknowledging this point, he reluctantly led the way. Brando was not afraid of any tricks. First of all, Andrique used black magic to manipulate people and could see if they were lying. Second of all, Mephistopheles followed beside him. On the surface, it seemed like nothing was wrong, but in reality, the vampire's dagger was pressed against the knight's back. It was too easy for a gold ranker to spy on a silver ranker. The knight brought them in through the back door of the manor's kitchen. In fact, Brando's group was disguised as the Count's knight, but they were in charge of their own areas. Without a guide they could not just wander around. The knight led them through a long corridor and came to a room. He knocked on the door and said, "Lord Ronan." Along the way Brando asked a lot of questions about the manor's interior. He already knew that the one resting in the room was one of the gold rankers, the captain of the night. "What's the matter?" a voice asked from inside the room. It seemed to be a middle-aged man. Brando held his breath and signaled the knight to answer with his eyes. The knight hesitated for a moment before answering nervously, "It's like this, Lord Ronan. Enric and the others seem to have found something wrong with the Count's horse." "Horse? Which one?" "It's Lone Fire." Lone Fire was the name of the Binault horse. The voice inside the room immediately became serious. "Lone Fire?" The person in the room obviously understood the value of the Binault horse. He could not help but ask in displeasure, "What are you doing? Don't you know that horse is the Count's most beloved horse?" To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 543. The displeased tone of the person in the room made the knight nervous. He turned to look at Brando. "Tell him that it's because of the stable's gatekeeper. They changed the black beans to normal fodder without permission." Brando remained calm and simply mouthed the words to the other party. He knew that the pure-blooded Pinot horses were extremely delicate. Their materials were all specially made, and the beans in the fodder had to be black beans that were a specialty of the Surin Plateau. Otherwise there would be problems. The knight hurriedly repeated his answer. This time the people in the room believed him. In fact, he didn't suspect anything. After all, this was Ampere Seal. He really couldn't think of anyone who would dare to cause trouble under the nose of the Holy Cathedral. He pondered for a moment and replied, "This is really troublesome. Wait for me to come out." The rustling sound of clothes being put on could be heard from the room. After a while, the captain of the night opened the door. He was about to put on a stern face and reprimand these careless knights. These knights were his direct subordinates. If they caused a problem, the Count would definitely blame it on him. This time, it was the Count's favorite horse that had a problem. This made him extremely unhappy. But before he could speak, Brando, Andrique and Mephistopheles rushed into the room. "Enemy." At that moment, the captain of the night reacted. Ronan had been famous in Yenbao for many years. He had been the captain of Yenbao's guards when he was very young. He was extremely experienced in fighting enemies and was used to carrying a sword at all times. As soon as Brando and the other two entered the room, the middle-aged knight had already pulled out his sword. Even Brando was shocked by Ronan's reaction speed. This was really fast. If it was any other enemy, the captain of the night would probably have had time to warn them. Unfortunately, he was facing an even more abnormal opponent. Brando and the other two alone were 3 gold rankers. They would definitely have the advantage in a 3-on-1 battle. Andrique and Mephistopheles were even more superior in terms of race. Brando himself was needless to say. With his current strength, he could even fight against an opponent with elemental awakening. At least, Devard the Eagle was proof. As soon as Brando made his move, Ronan was immediately frightened. The difference in swordsmanship was not at all on the same level. He subconsciously wanted to retreat and warn the other people in the manor, but at this moment he heard a faint voice. Domain of Silence. The Shire stood outside the house and pointed inside. A domain of silence that covered a radius of nearly 20 feet immediately spread out. All the sounds in the area seemed to be swallowed by an unknown existence in an instant. Sparks flew everywhere when the swords clashed, but not a single sound was made. The scene was really strange, but our Lord Knight was not in the mood to care about all this at the moment. As soon as the domain of silence was spread out, Brando attacked even more freely. In just 3 rounds, Ronan had no choice but to abandon his sword and surrender. In fact, it was not that the knight wanted to abandon his sword, but if he didn't, he would probably lose his hand as well. In desperation, he had no choice but to throw away his sword and raise his hand. Brando stopped his attacks and pointed his sword at the knight's heart. He couldn't help but look at the knight. The other party was quite particular about the nobleman's spirit. Only when he realized that no amount of effort could change the current situation did he throw away his sword and surrender. Compared to the knight behind him, this knight was much more moral. In fact, this era was like this. You couldn't expect a knight to do too much for the Lord. Unless it was a true retainer, very few people would be willing to make unnecessary sacrifices for the sake of their lord. The current situation was exactly the same as when the nobles of Fortress Reden fled. Brando didn't feel surprised at all. "Who are you?" Ronan raised his hand, but his eyes were still sharp as he stared at Brando and the others. He mouthed the question. "None of your business." Brando replied, "Right now, I want to borrow the help of your count to complete a task. I can guarantee that I won't harm his life, and I won't put him in any disadvantageous situation." "The count has no reason to agree to your request." Ronan's expression was calm, but his mouth was full of sarcasm. Brando shrugged his shoulders. Being called a thief made him feel a little ashamed, but he couldn't care less. "Right now we are in control of the situation. This reason is sufficient. In fact, we don't need you to do anything. We just need you to stay here for a period of time." At this time, the Shire had already cast a soundproof spell, so he cancelled the silence spell. Ronan carefully looked at everyone present. "I can't answer any of your questions on behalf of the Count," he replied. "It doesn't matter. I just need you to help draw out the other gold-ranked expert. Don't worry, we will only restrain him." Brando replied, "As far as I know, there are 3 people with the same strength as you in this manner. In addition to the Count's personal bodyguard, there is another person who lives on the 2nd floor, right? With your status, you should be able to go to the 2nd floor, right?" Ronan was silent. He fiercely glared at the knight behind Brando. Of course, he knew who told the young man in front of him. But after thinking about it, he shook his head. "Forgive me, but I can't accept it. This goes against my beliefs." When Brando heard this answer, he couldn't help but look at the other party in surprise. There were very few people who still held on to their beliefs in Erwin. Before meeting Coden, Brando thought that there were only people like himself, the princess and the Valkyrie. He shrugged his shoulders and withdrew his sword. He nodded to the other party. "Very well, I respect your choice." Ronan was slightly startled. He didn't think that these bandits who broke into the manor would be so easy to talk to. He couldn't help but frown as he stared at Brando. "What kind of trick are you trying to play? You should know that without my help, you won't be able to go to the 2nd floor. From the looks of it, you don't want to attract the attention of those outside." "I'm determined to win. If it doesn't work, I'll just have to force my way in." Brando replied, "I'm confident that I can control the situation in a short time. But if it can be simpler, I don't want to cause trouble." The middle-aged knight pursed his lips and frowned. Obviously, Brando's words were exactly what he had guessed. He couldn't help but look deeply at Brando. "You should know the consequences of spilling blood in the area controlled by the Holy Cathedral. No thief in Ampere Seal has dared to do so in the past 100 years. Brando stared back at the other party without backing down and replied calmly, "You've got 2 things wrong, sir. First, the person in front of you is not a thief. Second, I'm not afraid." When he said this, he had already made up his mind. There were still 2 days before the meeting of the nobles. Brando knew very well how history had led to a path with no future. He would not allow history to repeat itself. In the Amber Sword, he had seen Her Highness the Princess and the Valkyrie. He had fought side by side with many people, but this time he was going to fight alone. Ronan saw the burning determination in Brando's eyes and couldn't help but choke. He didn't know where these people came from, but they didn't look like ordinary bandits. He shook his head in his heart. How could they be bandits? Which bandits would dare to attack an Ampere Seal? He sighed. "You're not from the Lecken family?" The Lecken family? Brando felt like he had heard of this noble family before, but it didn't matter. He was sure that it wasn't some big family like Erwin or Cruz. Since when did Count Yenbao have a grudge with this small family? And they seemed to be very nervous. Brando's thoughts turned quickly. He suddenly thought that Count Yenbao's unusual intervention in the meeting of the nobles in Ampere Seal might have something to do with this matter. But this had nothing to do with his purpose, so he quickly shook his head. "Of course not. You're from the evil cult?" Ronan's brows relaxed a little, but he still frowned deeply. He suddenly thought of the rumors of the evil cult controlling the nobles and couldn't help but ask. However, as soon as he said this, the knight behind Brando suddenly changed his expression. In Wond, only one kind of people dared to ignore Martha's oath, and that was the evil cult. This meant that if Brando was from the evil cult, then wouldn't his promise to not kill him be a lie? Thinking of this, the knight couldn't help but tremble a little. But Brando shook his head and said, "No, we believe in Lady Martha just like you, my lord. We see dusk and chaos as heresy." Ronan raised his eyebrows. The evil cult would never say such things. He sighed in relief and thought for a moment. Then as long as you swear in front of Lady Martha and do what you said before, I can consider helping you persuade the Count. You agree? The captain smiled bitterly. How could he not agree? He could see that Brendel's group was powerful, and the 3 gold rankers under the Count were no match for them. Not to mention that he was already under their control. In fact, there were only 2 gold rankers under the Count's command that he could use. If the other party really attacked, the manor would be a bloodbath. Whether it was considering his own life or his loyalty to the Count, this was the best choice for him. Ronan sighed. Yenbao used to be one of the top nobles in Erewhon. During the most glorious era of the family, they had 2 elemental awakenings. Their status was no less than the current Grand Duke Erek. It was because of this strength that the Yenbao nobles could be independent of the other nobles in the kingdom and claim to be one. But he didn't expect that in just 100 years, the Yenbao family would fall to such a state. It seemed that anyone could bully them, and they even had to consider relying on other Grand Dukes. It was a disgrace. The captain of the night thought of this and was about to nod in agreement. But at this moment, a loud explosion suddenly came from above everyone's heads. At that moment, it was as if the entire manor jumped. Brando's heart tightened. He couldn't help but look up at the ceiling. The explosion came from the 2nd floor. Did something happen outside? But he couldn't think of anything that could cause such an effect. Could it be that the little Roman was bold enough to test a fireball on the manor at this time? But it didn't seem like a big fireball. It was more like someone had summoned a meteorite. These messy thoughts flashed through Brando's mind. He turned around and saw that the corridor had become chaotic. Many of the knight who had been sleeping opened the door and rushed out. Brando's expression changed. He immediately shouted, "Close the door." 2 updates, 1 update 4000, 1 update 3000. I originally said that I would explode yesterday, but I was feeling a little unwell yesterday, so I will start from today. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 544. Brando had just finished shouting when he suddenly realized that the knight who had rushed out of the room in a panic were not running towards him. Instead, they were screaming and running towards the outside of the house. Brando was stunned. What happened? He turned around and suddenly felt that the whole manor was trembling violently. It was as if a giant beast was walking on the ceiling. The wooden planks were making unbearable creaking sounds, and dust was constantly falling down. Not good. The Knight Captain Ronan's face changed. The voice had reached the stairs in a blink of an eye. Watch him. Brando shouted as he rushed out of the corridor and looked towards the stairs. He did not know when this manor was built. The stairs were built in the style of the flamboyant sculpture of Anson the 11th. But at this moment, the artwork was trembling violently as if it was suffering from asthma. The fakes of famous paintings hanging on the corridor fell to the ground like hailstones. Brando did not have time to mourn for these expensive fakes. Suddenly, a dazzling light rolled up from the stairs. Golden flames spewed out and instantly turned the paintings on the ground into ashes. The temperature in the corridor suddenly rose. The flames flooded the corridor like a waterfall from the 2nd floor. Several knights who did not have time to escape were engulfed in the sea of flames. They only had time to let out a scream, which was dragged out from their throats and then turned into a mournful wail under the night sky. For a moment, the whole corridor was illuminated in golden red. The flames reflected on Brando's face, but the flames that extended forward bypassed him as if they were afraid of him, forming an oval hole. Magic flames. Brando stood in the middle of the hole and immediately recognized the essence of the flames. But there was only one thing that could create such a waterfall of flames. Brando squinted his eyes without changing his expression and gently pressed his right hand on the hilt of his sword. Then, with a loud bang, a violent monster rushed out of the flames. This monster had a huge bullfrog head with long horns on its head. Its skin was as red as blood, and its muscles were bulging. Its arms supported its body on the ground, and its small hind legs were filled with the explosive power of a frog. But the most eye-catching thing about this monster was the raging flames on its back and arms. Its eyes were spitting fire, and smoke with the pungent smell of sulfur was constantly coming out from its bloody mouth. This was a lord of the abyss, also from the scorching hell. It was an evil creature from the Sulphur River. However, compared to the low-tier demons that the Black Flame sect's disciples controlled, this Lord of the Abyss was considered a real big guy. It had high intelligence and its strength was equivalent to the peak of Gold tier. Why would such a thing appear in the core area ruled by the Holy Cathedral? Brando was extremely puzzled. But just when he noticed the demon, the monster also noticed him. It immediately let out a deafening roar and raised its flaming claws to grab Brando. The monster's flaming claws were almost the size of a round table. Brando did not dare to be careless. He quickly stepped back and dodged, and the monster's claws hit the ground with a bang. A circle of flames spread out from the monster's palm. The wooden floor on the first floor of the manor was instantly charred with red sparks. The Abyssal Lord missed its attack, so it pushed off the ground with its claws and then pounced on Brando. The Abyssal Lord from the sulfuric river was covered in flames. Its body was about 4 times the size of Brando. Its body almost filled the entire corridor. As it moved forward, the flames on both sides of its body gradually pressed against the wooden walls on both sides of the corridor. The wooden planks let out a terrifying cry and were then swallowed by the flames. It was as if they were being sucked into the world of flames behind the Abyssal Lord. Behind Brando was Luo Ning's room. If he took another step back, Falern and the Nightsong Tiger would definitely not be able to protect themselves. Helpless, Brando could only raise his sword with both hands and take a step forward. The sword in his hand was swung towards the monster's chest in a circle. In terms of absolute strength, Brando was slightly inferior to the Abyssal Lord. But with the amplification of the power crystal, if his sword were to hit the monster, it would be enough to cause it to suffer. The chest was the Abyssal Lord's weak spot. The monster's intelligence was extremely high. When Brando swung his sword, it immediately stretched out its long claws and grabbed Brando's sword. Its movements were astonishingly fast. Brando did not even have time to retract his sword. The claws of the Abyssal Lord seemed to be made of metal. The steel sword that Brando used to conceal his identity actually let out a teeth-numbing screech when it cut through the Abyssal Lord's claws. For a moment, sparks flew everywhere. Brando's attack was stopped. He could only feel his hands going numb. The Abyssal Lord's strength was at least 100 points higher than his. Fortunately, his base strength was also over 200 points, or else he would have been sent flying. Brando could not help but take a deep breath. The approaching Abyssal Lord's scorching hot breath almost set his lungs on fire. Even though he knew that this feeling was not real, he could not help but hold his breath. This Abyssal Lord was the most troublesome enemy he had encountered after Andesha. Although Devard the Eagle was far more powerful than this cursed beast, he had actually used a trick during the duel. If Devard had gone all out from the start, it would have been difficult for him to win without using the Planeswalker system. However, the Abyssal Lord from the Sulphur River was not like a human swordsman who had learned the etiquette of nobles. They were born to fight, and once they entered the state they would only use 200% of their strength. At this moment, Brando felt that his eyebrows were about to burn. The thought flashed through his mind, but his body did not slow down. He threw away his sword without hesitation and raised his left hand to parry the Abyssal Lord's claws. At the same time he lunged forward and punched with his right fist. The fool's frenzy. Get the hell out of here. Brendel roared and unleashed all his strength. His right hand seemed to have penetrated through the gap in space and landed directly on the monster's chest. There was a muffled sound like tearing silk, and just as the monster raised its head, the expression on its huge and ugly face froze at this moment. With a loud bang, it turned into a red blur and flew backward. Ah! The Nightsong Tiger, Falern, and Mephistopheles, who had never seen Brando use frenzy before, were so frightened that they could not help but cry out. Ronan's face was pale. Of course he knew what the Abyssal Lord was. He thought that he would not be able to escape this time, but he did not expect that the Abyssal Lord would be able to send the Abyssal Lord flying with a single punch. Who was the real Abyssal Lord? He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. Demons were indeed the most resilient of all monsters. The Lord of the Abyss had the ability to reflect damage, and he did not have the time to deal with it. As a result, he was heavily injured as well. His status had turned yellow, and his HP had decreased by more than 300 points. This was the result of activating the Berserk innate talent and increasing his vitality by more than half. My lord, your hand. Mephistopheles suddenly covered their mouths. Brando's left and right hands were burning with hellfire, as if he was wearing a pair of flaming gloves. If it was a normal person's hand, it would have been burned to ashes. However, Brando's magic resistance was extremely high, and the flames were only a little hot. Brando waved his hand, and the flames on his hand suddenly retreated like a gust of wind. The Knight Captain, Ronan, looked at Brendel with even more reverence. He was definitely a monster. Ronan's feet were already on his sword, ready to break out of the encirclement and escape with the Count if he was distracted. Although he was a knight, his loyalty to the Earl was always his #1 priority. However, when he saw Brando make a move, Ronan could not help but sigh and give up on this unrealistic idea. He looked at the direction of the corridor. The originally terrifying Abyssal Lord was sent flying by Brando's punch. After it crashed through the wall behind it, it was buried under the wall. Even the flames on its body had weakened a lot. A moment later, a thick smoke suddenly emitted from under the rubble. Then sparks rose and formed a hexagram on the ruins of the manor. The hexagram quickly dimmed and turned into a pile of charred wreckage. The Abyssal Lord was actually killed by his punch. However, Brando was not too surprised. The power of his punch had almost reached the active elemental awakening stage, and it happened to hit the Abyssal Lord's weakness. Moreover, the Abyssal Lord was not a boss, so it was normal for it to be killed by a punch. The Abyssal Lord was too careless. It probably thought that humans would not dare to fight it in close combat. As a result, it was taken advantage of by Brando, who had monstrous magic resistance. Brando stared at the pile of ashes and panted. He turned to Falern and said, "Abyssal Lords cannot be easily killed outside of the Sulphur River. After they receive fatal damage, they will transform into another form and be teleported back to the scorching hell. However, the teleportation circle will not take away the items they carry with them. Go and see if there are any spoils of war." "Why me again?" Falern could not help but ask. "Because you are lucky." Falern could not help but stare at him in confusion. However, Brando did not care. Instead, he turned back and stared at Ronan. When the explosion on the second floor was heard, this guy's expression changed. Coupled with the reaction of the night outside, these Yenbao people must know something about this Abyssal Lord. Brando did not believe that a high-level Abyssal Lord would suddenly appear in the core area of the Holy Cathedral controlled by Erwin. He stared at Ronan with a serious expression. "I don't think there is a spatial passage to the scorching hell in this manner. Sir Knight, I think you should know something about it, right?" Unexpectedly, Ronan, who had softened his attitude before, was unusually firm this time. He pursed his lips and shook his head without saying a word. At this moment, a series of soft footsteps suddenly sounded. Brando turned back because he heard the footsteps coming from the half-burnt and crumbling staircase. "I'm sorry, sir. I accidentally summoned this Abyssal Lord," a weak voice replied. "P.S. Chest tightness, shortness of breath, and panic for a week. The examination said that it was a respiratory infection, myocardial ischemia, and there was no improvement even after 2 days of fluid transfusion. Thinking that it was the first day of May, I still wrote a chapter. It's so uncomfortable. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 545. "I'm sorry, sir. I accidentally summoned this demon." Brando turned his head back to the source of the weak voice. He couldn't help but praise the beautiful young man in his heart. The boy on the stairs, in his moon-white silk pajamas, had one hand on his chest, was moving up and down on the charred wall. The young man's face was slightly sharp and delicate. Under his black shoulder-length hair, his eyes were as bright as the stars. His skin was as white as snow and his thin lips were as bright as a rose. The young man pursed his lips. His eyebrows were slightly wrinkled as if he was suspicious of the origin of Brando and the others. Brando couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He couldn't help but think of the silver elf Nalathar who was sleeping in the Emerald Forest. But at this moment he had to admit with jealousy that in this world, there were indeed some humans who were more beautiful than the elves. But soon he saw the young man's pointy ears. It turned out that he was a half-elf. Fortunately, Brando was relieved. At least the other party didn't destroy his last dignity as a human. "Count, are you all right?" Ronan bowed slightly behind Brando. The young man looked at his captain of the night and nodded. This action undoubtedly confirmed his identity. This 15 or 16-year-old young man was actually Count Yenbao. Brando couldn't help but raise his eyebrows suspiciously. He stared at the young man's face that was a little too young. The young man was also sizing up Brando. His starry eyes flashed with a slightly doubtful light. Most of the disguise spells in this world would be automatically dispelled once the target used force or any other skills. At this moment, Brando and the others were no longer a patrol knight. It was no longer the image of the patrolling knights, but an existence with a long cloak and black smoke lingering all over, looking similar to the sheephead disciple. But the sheephead cult and the demons were natural allies. They would never do such a thing. The young man didn't show any fear or uncertainty. But at this moment, there was a banging sound coming from the stairs. A female knight with long blonde hair rushed down like a bolt of lightning. When she saw Brando and the others beside Ronan, she couldn't help but show a surprised expression. She pulled out her sword and scolded angrily, "Ronin? Who are you people?" "Gold rank." Brando pursed his lips. It seemed that this young lady was the second gold-ranked subordinate of the young count. However, he could not help but glance at her breasts. The female knight was wearing Erwin's military uniform, and her breasts were simply too voluptuous. Her good upbringing was even a little exaggerated. One could not help but associate her with a cow. In fact, this female knight could also be considered a beauty. If beauty was justice, then this lady must be one of the best in the justice camp. She was at most 2. He looked to be around 17 or 18 years old. At this age, he could be considered a hero among the younger generation in Erwin. The female knight had curly hair and her military uniform was messy. It seemed that she had just gotten out of bed. Noticing Brando's gaze, she couldn't help blushing as she covered her unbuttoned shirt with her left hand. "What are you looking at?" "Nah." At this time, the handsome young man who was Count Yenbao stopped the female knight. He then raised his head and looked at Brando. "Count Yenbao?" Brando asked. "My name is Dilfrey de Audener. I am the only heir of the Egret family and the current Count Yenbao." The young man introduced himself with a gentle voice. Brando could not see any panic on his face. He only looked a little tired. The young man put his hand on his chest. He replied politely, "First of all, thank you for helping me restrain the demon." "You are welcome. However, as a noble, it is not very good to make a deal with the demon, right?" Brando narrowed his eyes and asked. The young man was slightly stunned. The female knight beside him had already angrily scolded Brando. She jumped up high and slashed her sword at him. Brando did not have a weapon in his hand at this moment. However, he opened his left thumb and index finger, and a vortex appeared in the middle of the magic triangle. He clenched his right hand, and the Haurangaya, which was surrounded by black smoke, had already appeared in his hand. Brando pulled out the Haurangaya and blocked the long sword in the female knight's hand. His strength was far superior to the other party. Suddenly, the cow knight was sent flying with her sword and crashed into the carbonized staircase. After a loud bang, the poor staircase stopped. She was reduced to ashes. However, Brando immediately scolded the freakishly strong woman. After activating Frenzy, his strength was close to 500, and he was standing at the peak of elemental awakening. He did not expect that his hand would be sore from the impact of a low gold level enemy. Because if the female knight was in the game in the past, she would be a pure strength warrior. What a freak. The freakishly strong female knight quickly climbed out of the wreckage of the stairs with a dirty face. Looking at her gnashing teeth, she was ready to fight again. However, the young count stopped her. Dilfrey obviously had his own concerns. He looked at Brando. He already knew that his people were no match for the other party. He suddenly turned his head and stared outside the manor's walls that were already full of holes. "Sir, although I don't know where you came from, I hope you can do me a favor." Dilfrey looked in the direction of the forest in the distance of the manor and suddenly said, "She said." At this time, Brando also heard the noise outside the manor. The sound of iron boots stepping on the muddy ground was mixed with the sound of horses neighing. The guards, he was all too familiar with this sound. Brendel also looked in that direction, and it did not take long. Not long after, the figure of the leading knight appeared in the direction of the manor's main gate. "It's the guards from the nearby town." Ronan immediately frowned. Brando turned his head and immediately understood what the young man meant. But he narrowed his eyes and replied, "I need a promise, Count." Dilfrey bit her lower lip. "What do you want?" "I can only agree to your request under the condition that it does not harm the interests of the family." "So you are the only successor of Yenbao in this generation?" Brando suddenly asked. The knight passed through the courtyard and was already close to the manor, but was stopped by the manor's guards. Dilfrey looked over there and could not help but hold her breath. She looked at Brando hesitantly and finally nodded. Dilfrey could only bet that this strange person was not the enemy. For a moment, she could not help but feel uneasy in her heart. "Count," Ronan could not help but say. But the young man shook his head at him. Brendel knew what the young count was worried about. The Holy Cathedral of Fire's highest law clearly stated that if a noble colluded with a devil, they would be sentenced to death, and their family's glory would be stripped for 3 generations. Any noble who colluded with the devil would be punished. No one dared to bear such consequences. Although he did not know why the other party would summon demons, Brando saw Dilfrey's long eyelashes drooping and knew that the young man was panicking. It was a good time. Luck seemed to be unexpectedly good tonight. Brando looked up and saw a bright moon hanging high in the forest between the Anceli Mountains. I hope you cannot attend the meeting in Ampere Seal. Brando pondered for a moment and made his request. That's impossible. You want to replace me in the meeting of the nobles? How can I guarantee that you won't hurt Yenbao during the meeting? He furrowed his brows and glared angrily at Brendel. You want to replace me in the meeting? How can I guarantee that you won't harm Yenbao during the meeting? If you offend any of the Grand Dukes, it will be a disaster for my family. I can swear in the name of Lady Martha and my honor. Brando replied. Even the most loyal oath has a loophole. Dilfrey gritted his teeth and replied, Sir, I have no other way out. I hope you don't force me to fight to the death. Brando and the young man looked at each other, but the young man's determination was beyond his expectations. The young man's eyes were as bright as the stars, without a trace of weakness or compromise. However, the Yenbao family only had one heir left. Something must have happened. Brando thought hard but could not remember what happened to Yenbao in the game. It was as if this area did not exist in Erewhon's history. The two of them faced each other and the atmosphere was silent for a moment. The night outside had broken through the blockade of the guards. They had obviously rushed over after hearing the explosion. Brando noticed that there was no fighting outside, which meant that the knight on guard did not find the Roman and the others hiding in the forest. Yes, this was a relief to him. However, the security forces in Ampere Seal were notoriously difficult to deal with. If he could not reach an agreement with the young Earl, tonight's operation would be in vain. You want to attend the meeting in Ampere Seal? The night was getting closer and closer, and the young man finally could not hold back and spoke first. Brando nodded. Can you promise not to offend any of the forces? The young man asked. I'm afraid I can't promise that. Brando spread his hands. He had no intention of lying. He could not drag innocent people down with him for his own selfish reasons. However, I may be able to promise that at least I won't implicate you. The young man stared at him. The night was almost at the gate of the manor. They had already seen the huge hole, but there was no fire in the corridor. Brando and Dilfrey stood in the dark, so the knight did not notice the situation in the house. After a while, the young man finally spoke. Then I can take you to the meeting as a follower. Dilfrey looked at Brando nervously. After all, this strange man did not seem like someone who liked to be under others. However, to her relief, Brando nodded. Okay, deal. Brando took out a crystal ball from under his cloak and gestured to the young man. Recording crystal. Despicable. The young man could not help but grit his teeth. Brando smiled helplessly. At this time, the knight finally entered the house. Brando had already pulled down his cloak and pretended to be Dilfrey's guards with the Nightsong Tiger and the others. He stood behind the young man without saying a word. The young man took a deep breath and glanced at the corridor. Pharaoh was already there. He was slightly relieved when he saw that the hexagram array left by the demon was almost cleared. He walked down the stairs and faced the night guards. However, Brando immediately noticed that there were not only the night guards. He saw that there were also some well-equipped knights wearing silver armor and red battle robes mixed in with their dark blue uniforms. Brando was slightly surprised. Royal Knight, why are they here? He suddenly realized something and lowered his head to send a telepathic message to Medisa. Medisa, ask Sue how far is this place from the Rhyme Manor? Count, may I know what happened here? Do you need our help? At this time, a female royal knight with a good figure walked out of the crowd and looked up at Dilfrey, who was on the stairs. The knight's voice was soft and clear like a silver bell, but Brando could not help but feel his scalp tingle when he heard it. He raised his head and saw a face that he couldn't be more familiar with. The one wearing the royal knight's armor was a young girl with a brown ponytail who looked very innocent. She had a few strange swords hanging from her waist. At first glance, people would think that she was using some kind of strange swordsmanship. But Freya was definitely practicing the purest form of military swordsmanship. P.S. So today I went to the affiliated hospital of the Sanjun Medical University for a checkup. There are no structural problems with my heart. It's just a lack of blood, so I need to exercise more. By the way, my symptoms are much better today. If I can maintain it tomorrow, I can resume updating. The doctor asked me to do a 24-hour ECG on the 15th. Damn, it's the 15th, not the 14th, not the 13th, it's the 15th. Doctor, are you actually sent by my enemy to mess with me? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 546. Freya took a step forward. She was wearing the silver-plated armor of a knight of the Imperial Army. The golden edges of the armor reflected a hazy halo under the moonlight in the forest. After she got off her horse, her dark red knight's cloak hung on the ground. There were 2 silver tassels on the side of the cloak that represented her military rank. It seemed that she was the leader of this group of knights. She paused and looked at the manor that was about to turn into ruins. She identified herself and said, "We are the Knight of Her Royal Highness. Is there anything I can help you with?" No, it's nothing." The young count also recognized the identity of these knights. He did not want to complicate matters, so he quickly shook his head and replied. This made the knight girl frown. After all, she was no longer the ignorant country girl of the past. The future goddess of war raised her head and looked suspiciously at Count Yenbao and his party. The moonlight was moving above the clouds, and at this moment, it just so happened to penetrate the hole in the roof and sprinkle a cold silver light on the broken stairs, reflecting their figures. Freya could not help but be startled. She was surprised that there was such a beautiful and cute boy, but her sword-like eyebrows immediately furrowed. The 2 people behind Dilfrey had caught her attention. No matter how she looked at them, they looked very suspicious. Brando suddenly broke out in a cold sweat and quickly lowered his head. This girl from the countryside of Bucci had become a lot more mature after studying at the Knights Academy for half a year. Her suspicious gaze gave him the illusion that he had been exposed. He knew that things were not going well. If he was called out at this time, he would really be done for. Freya did not know what they were doing. Kidnapping a noble was punishable by death. Of course, according to the words of the Shire, if his lord was to be hanged, the noose around his neck would probably be tied more than 10 times. But after all, Brando did not want his plan to fail. "My lord, do you think Miss Freya recognized us?" The Shire could not help but break out in a cold sweat and carefully asked through telepathy. Brando cursed the jinx in his heart. At this time, Count Yenbao finally reacted. The handsome young man from the north did not seem to want the knight of the royal family to stay here any longer. Dilfrey quickly found an excuse and said, "Madam, please don't worry. It's just that one of my subordinates had a little accident when he was experimenting with magic. I'll call someone to deal with it immediately. Please excuse me." As soon as he said that, Brando and the Shire both let out a long sigh. Most nobles had 1 or 2 adepts as their retainers. This was nothing strange. However, Freya still felt that this young noble was not telling the truth. She raised her head and looked at Brando and the Shire again, muttering in her heart, "Strange guys." During this period of time, Maynard had crammed her with a bunch of knowledge about nobles. Although she didn't remember most of it, she at least knew that the nobles more or less had their own secrets. She understood that she couldn't stay here and be an annoying person. In fact, she originally came over after hearing the explosion to see if there were any emergencies. Since the other party said that they didn't need their help, she thought about it and prepared to leave. However, at this time, the guards who had just been sent back to the gate by Dilfrey were escorted back. Brando looked up and suddenly cried out. It turned out that there was another team of knights at the gate of the manor. The style of their armor was similar to Freya's, but there were a few more tassels on their cloaks. These were the knights of the royal family. These people were much more difficult to deal with than the Knight Academy students. Brando immediately lowered his head. They should be the direct officers of this group of students. But I don't know which one of the knight captains is by the princess side at this time. Is it Deng Deng or Deus? Brando lowered his head and sorted out his thoughts. It was impossible for the students to act alone. There must be a knight captains patrolling with these young people. Now, it seemed that Freya was just a vanguard. The names of the 2 knight captains flashed through his mind. If he remembered correctly, the knight captains by the side of the half-fairy princess at this time of the year should be one of the 2. Deng Deng and Deus were not famous NPCs in the Amber Sword, but they used to be supporters of the royal family. Brando also took on their missions. If he remembered correctly, the strength of these 2 people was only at the pinnacle of silver. They were not even the top figures in the royal faction. He lowered his head and secretly guessed, but he did not expect that his usually accurate prediction would miss this time. The knights quickly came to the front. The leader of the knights spoke with a female voice. "What happened?" His voice was low and calm, and his tone was filled with unquestionable seriousness. When Brendel heard this voice, it was as if he was struck by lightning from the sky. His whole body froze. He looked up as if he had seen a ghost, just in time to see the female knight's calm and indifferent expression. This voice. Who is this woman? He saw the golden tassel on the side of Maynard's cloak. It was the captain of the night. However, Brando could swear on his honor as a veteran player who had experienced almost all the changes in Erewhon's history. From the Year of Blooming to the Year of the Sword, there was not a single female in the Royal Knight's ranks. Not to mention the Royal Knight rank, there were almost no females above the rank of Grand Knight. However, what really surprised him was the female knight's voice. There was no way he had heard it wrongly. Her voice was so clear even in his dreams. At that moment he almost thought that he had returned to more than 10 years ago. His senior sister was standing in front of all of them, leading them with her sword. He closed his eyes and it was as if time had turned back. That indifferent, calm and warm face appeared in front of him again. Her smile was so warm that it made one's heart feel at peace. He almost blurted out that familiar name, but he held himself back. Maynard was born in Cipher. She inherited the snow-white skin of the people of Cipher. Her long black hair was like an obsidian against her fair skin. She was born to be a stunning beauty. She was known as the cold beauty among the knight. But from Brando's point of view, even though this female knight had a unique temperament that was similar to his senior, they were not the same person. He could not help but take a deep breath. His heart was filled with uncertainty. But in the end he returned to his original question. Who is this woman? Brando was certain that he did not remember wrongly. Unless history had changed, there would not be a female knight in the royal faction. Even though he knew that history would change sooner or later because of him, the butterfly, but he did not expect the change to be reflected in such a small detail. It did not make any sense at all. He heard Freya call the female knight Maynard. Brando swore that he had never heard of such a name before. Even though it was impossible for him to know the background of all the nobles and socialites in Erewhon, Brando was confident that he would not miss out on some well-known NPCs. The fact that she was able to become a knight captain at such a young age meant that she was not an ordinary person. But unfortunately, Brando could not think of such a person even after racking his brain. There were two possibilities in front of him. The first possibility was that Maynard was just an alias, and there might be a famous person behind this name that he knew. However, Brando could not connect the female knight in front of him with the famous people in his memory. This woman seemed to have appeared out of thin air. Then there was the second possibility. History might really have changed because of his arrival, and this change might not only affect Owain's history after his arrival, but even the history before his arrival might have changed as well. This change was completely unpredictable. In other words, if this possibility existed, Brando would not have been surprised when he found out that the princess was actually a cute boy. Brando frowned deeply as he stared at Maynard, who had suddenly appeared. At this time, the female knight had already turned her head sideways to listen to Freya's words. She raised her head, and as if she had noticed Brando's gaze, she looked in his direction. The female knight had a pair of deep black eyes, and her eyelids reflected a faint silver glow. Her gaze met Brando's and both of them were slightly startled. Brando was not sure if the female knight had noticed him, because Maynard quickly turned her head away as if nothing had happened. She did not even intend to dismount from her horse. She simply greeted Dilfrey on the horse. The Yenbao family had never had any contact with Erewhon's circle of nobles, so it seemed that the royal faction did not have any plans to attack this ancient family. Maynard's etiquette was meticulous, but that was all. Brando saw her looking at Dilfrey strangely twice in a row, but in the end she did not say anything and quickly left with the knight. What did she notice? Brando stared in that direction and thought. When the female knight walked to the gate of the manor, she turned her head back for the first time. Her glance from afar was immediately caught by Brando. This confirmed his previous feeling. Both of them seemed to feel that something was wrong with each other. At this time, Brando had already thrown away his previous messy thoughts. He suddenly felt a little worried. Did this woman see through their identities? Obviously, she did not listen to Dilfrey's words earlier. This is a difficult character to deal with. He let out a sigh of relief, but he still thought that no matter what, she would not be able to guess his identity. Disguising himself as an envoy of a noble to participate in a meeting that would decide the future of the kingdom. Perhaps no one in this world would think of such a bold thing except for him. But similar to Brando's guess, when Maynard turned around in the thick twilight outside the gate of the manor, the only thing that puzzled her was Brando's strange look. Her strength was not prominent in the knight regiment. She was famous for her swordsmanship. Most people only knew that she was a close friend of the princess and the #1 swordsman among the princess's left and right attendants. However, Maynard had already reached the early stage of gold. Naturally, she felt Brando's gaze. She lowered her head. Freya, who was beside her, immediately noticed the confusion in her heart. She could not help but ask, "What's wrong, Knight Commander?" You also noticed those two suspicious fellows? It seemed that the young girl had been holding a grudge against Brando and the Shire. Especially after leaving the manor, she felt that the two people were more and more familiar, but she could not think of Brando at the moment. Come to think of it, how could Brando appear here? Freya subconsciously came to this conclusion. Oh. Maynard looked at the young girl who was recently selected as a reserve knight. She was puzzled and asked, "Two?" "Yes, two. Senior, weren't you looking over there just now?" Freya asked. "I always felt that they were familiar. I was wondering if they were fugitives on the wanted list. Unfortunately, I can't remember at the moment. Look at their sneaky appearance. When I was still in Butchie, I often saw these guys crossing the border." She was talking about the fugitives and fugitives. Madara was a paradise for these people. Yes. However, Maynard only responded, "Forget it. It's better to have less trouble." Freya looked at her female commander. She obviously did not want to talk about it anymore. She could only sigh and keep quiet. Author's note: sigh, after 2 sad weeks I can finally get back to work. I went out to rest for 2 weeks. After 2 long trips, my body has somewhat recovered, but it doesn't seem to be completely recovered. Another thing is that I have finalized the release of the traditional version of the book with the Taiwanese side. It is said to be in July. In short, you don't have to worry about the book being out of print. Well, you can expect the problem of rushing the manuscript. Finally, today is May 14th. There are still 8 hours before the gates of hell open again after 10 years. Of course, I have to go to the hospital first tomorrow before I can come back to fight with Big Pineapple. Comrades, I hope the doctor will not ask for leave tomorrow. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.